We all know that when people hear the word jihad, they imagine battles, armies, or dramatic scenes from history. But what if the truth was far quieter? So quiet that it began with a barefoot boy in a sleepy oasis town, waking at dawn to tend goats and recite Qur'an under palm trees? What if your life as a jihad warrior was more patience than sword, more routine than glory? In today's video, we'll talk about what your everyday life as a frontier soldier in the early Islamic Empire would actually be like. So let's not waste any time, and let's begin. He grew up in a small oasis town where the desert felt less like a barrier and more like an old, familiar neighbor. Dawn always arrived quietly there. First came the faint blue light seeping through palm fronds, then the soft cooing of doves perched on mud brick rooftops. Before the rest of the settlement stirred, he would step out into the cool sand, letting it sift between his toes as he stretched sleep from his limbs. The sky overhead still held traces of night, enough for a few lingering stars to blink like distant watchful eyes. His family's home sat on the edge of the date grove, close enough that the rustling leaves formed a constant backdrop to their lives. He liked that sound, wind brushing past the tall trunks, leaves whispering secrets, the soft occasional plop of ripe dates falling into woven baskets. After Fajr prayer, he would help his mother sort them, removing dust, checking for soft spots, and arranging the good ones into clay bowls she would later trade in the market. Most of his mornings were spent tending the small herd of goats his father had left behind years ago. The animals knew him well, too well, he sometimes joked, because they recognized exactly when he was distracted and chose that moment to wander where they shouldn't. He walked them toward the grazing patches near the rocky ridge, the sun warming the back of his neck, his staff tapping gently in rhythm with his steps. Often, he recited short surahs under his breath, the words calming him, steadying his thoughts in a way nothing else quite did. By midday, the town hummed with life. Merchants set out their wares, folds of cloth dyed in desert colors, jars of honey, small piles of spices whose fragrances drifted lazily through the streets. He would stop by the scribe's stall sometimes, pretending to admire the reed pens and parchment while stealing glances at the careful strokes being written. He liked the idea of words traveling far beyond the oasis, carried by traders and scholars. But he wasn't a man of letters, not yet. His learning took place in the small masjid, where an aging teacher recited Qur'an slowly, deliberately, as though each verse had its own heartbeat. He sat cross-legged with the other boys, tracing each word on his wooden tablet. When the teacher paused to explain a verse about patience or gratitude, he listened carefully, feeling those teachings settle deep inside him like cool water. There was something grounding about those lessons, something that made the world feel bigger and closer all at once. His evenings were simple, helping his mother prepare lentils or barley soup, carrying water from the well, sitting outside as the sky softened into red, then purple, then indigo. On most nights, families gathered on rooftops to enjoy the breeze. Children still played in the dust, running and laughing until their mothers called them down. The young man would watch them, a faint smile tugging at his lips, as he remembered being that small, when the world felt as uncomplicated as running fast enough to outrun one's own shadow. Life was not easy, but it was steady, predictable, safe. The kind of life where days blend into one another like beads woven into a single strand. And he believed it would go on like this for a long time. But one afternoon, as the heat pressed heavy against the town, and most people stayed indoors, a rider approached from the west. His horse was coated in dust, its sides heaving from the long journey. Children ran out first. Children always notice these things. And soon the adults followed, shielding their eyes from the bright sun. The rider dismounted slowly, stretching stiff muscles, before asking for the town elder. When they gathered in the masjid courtyard, the rider unrolled a sealed document and read aloud a call from the regional governor. Volunteers were needed for ribat duty along the frontier. Not a grand campaign, not conquest. A steady watch over border routes, protecting caravans and villages. A task of patience more than danger, but still a task requiring men willing to leave home. The words settled over the crowd like desert dust, soft, quiet, but impossible to ignore. The young man felt something shift inside him, a small stirring, not quite fear, not quite excitement, more like a tug at the heart, gentle but persistent. As the crowd dispersed, murmuring among themselves, he stood still in the fading afternoon light, the call echoing through him. Soon, he would have to choose, and that quiet, private decision would lead him into the world beyond the oasis, into chapter 2. That night, he lay awake on the rooftop beside his younger brother, staring at the stars scattered across the dark sky. The breeze was warm, carrying the scent of roasting barley from a neighbor's home. His brother kicked his feet idly and asked, half curious and half worried, "Do you think anyone from here will go?" He didn't answer right away. He watched one star slide slowly across the sky, a faint trail of light marking its passage. "Maybe," he finally said. "Someone always does." His brother turned to look at him, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" He sighed softly, not denying it. The call for volunteers had not been a declaration of war or a storybook summons. It was practical, almost humble. The frontier garrison needed more men to guard trade routes, protect scattered villages, and maintain watchtowers. The threats were not mighty armies, but wandering bandits, raiders seeking weak points. The unpredictable harshness of the land itself. It wasn't glorious work. It was steady, patient, unseen, and somehow that steadiness felt important. By the time he climbed back down into the house, his mother was waiting for him. She sat near the hearth, shaping dough into small flatbreads for the next day. The firelight made her face look both peaceful and tired. Without looking up, she said, "You've been quiet since the messenger came." He sat beside her, picking up a nut-brown date and rolling it between his fingers. "Mother, if I volunteered, would you be angry?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she smoothed another piece of dough, pressing its edges gently, almost lovingly. "Angry? No." She paused, then continued softly, "But I would worry. Every mother worries when a son leaves home." He looked down, guilt pricking at him. It's just rebat duty, not fighting. I know what it is, she replied. Guarding the borders is noble. Protecting travelers is a sadaqah in its own way. She studied his face, searching for signs of doubt. But you must go for the right reasons, not for adventure, not to impress anyone. Only if your heart feels it is service. It does, he whispered. Not excitement, just a feeling that I should help. His mother nodded slowly. A mixture of pride and sorrow softened her expression. Then Allah will watch over you. But tell your uncle before you decide. He has lived longer. He will speak sense. His uncle's home was small, but always full of noise. That evening, however, he sat outside alone, mending a torn saddle strap. The old man listened without interrupting as the young man explained his thoughts. When he finished, the uncle simply leaned back, squinting at him. You're not chasing glory, the uncle said. Good. Glory blinds. Responsibility doesn't. He tugged the leather to test his repair. If you leave, you'll grow faster than you expect. You'll learn patience, discipline, maybe hardship. And when you come home, you won't be the same boy. His voice softened. But I raised you like a son. And if you feel called, I won't stand in your way. The approval felt like a heavy weight lifting from his chest. By the next morning, the decision settled fully into him, quietly, without fanfare. He told his mother over breakfast. She bowed her head, whispering a prayer that sounded like both protection and release. His brother hugged him suddenly, tightly, then pretended it hadn't happened. Word spread through the oasis faster than he expected. The neighbors stopped him on the way to the well, offering kind words and blessings. Even the goats seemed to sense the change. They nudged him more gently as he fed them. He spent the next few days preparing. A neighbor gifted him a sturdy water skin. His mother stitched a fresh patch onto his robe. His uncle inspected the worn sandals he insisted on wearing and shook his head, handing him a better pair. The desert winds shifted, carrying the distant sound of a caravan winding through the outer dunes. Hearing it, his heart tugged forward, toward the unknown, toward service, toward whatever waited beyond the horizon. And so, with his belongings strapped into a modest bundle and a final prayer whispered at the masjid door, he took his first step away from home. Ahead of him stretched the long, sunlit road, the beginning of Chapter 3. The caravan moved early, long before the sun had finished waking the dunes. Camels swayed like slow, thoughtful creatures, their long necks bobbing as if nodding to every grain of sand. The leader of the caravan, a thick-bearded man with sun-creased eyes, raised his staff and called for the travelers to stay close. The young man tightened the strap of his water skin and found a place among the recruits, letting the steady rhythm of footsteps and camel bells pull him into the day. The desert at dawn had its own quiet beauty. Light spilled over the horizon in soft layers, pale pink, then gold, then a deeper, richer warmth that touched every dune. For a brief moment, the air tasted almost cool. He breathed it in deeply, savoring the freshness before the sun's full strength claimed the sky. Beside him walked a cheerful recruit who had introduced himself the night before as Ferris. Slightly shorter, slightly louder, and endlessly curious, Ferris began the morning with a grin. "You walk like someone who wants to outrun the sun," he joked, adjusting the rope tied around his pack. "I walk like someone who doesn't want to fall behind," the young man replied, smiling despite the heaviness he carried. Ferris laughed. "Then you chose the right place. No one here moves too fast." Ahead of them, camels grumbled their dusty complaints. Low, vibrating groans that sounded almost human. Saddles creaked, wooden frames shifting with each uneven step. The air filled with the mingled scents of wool, leather, and dried figs packed tightly in the merchant's bundles. As the morning grew warmer, the caravan left the last hints of greenery behind. The dunes stretched endlessly, soft and golden, shimmering as the sun climbed. Heat wrapped itself around them like a thick cloak. Sand crunched under every step. The young man wiped sweat from his brow, grateful for the thin cloth wrapped loosely around his head. Despite the discomfort, the journey had a comforting rhythm. The desert felt ancient, steady, larger than any worry he carried. Sometimes Ferris chattered about his family, his hopes, or the spices he wanted to buy once they reached the frontier city. Other times, the group walked in silence, letting the expanse around them fill the space where words might have been. By midday, they reached a small gathering of stalls set up beneath rough palm fiber awnings, an improvised market for passing caravans. Traders called out their offers. Water cooled in clay jars, strips of dried meat, almonds dusted with salt, cloth dyed in earthy reds and deep blues. The young man bought a handful of dates and thanked the merchant, noticing the man's cracked lips and sunburned skin. Everyone here, merchant or traveler, lived by the mercy of the desert. Children darted between the stalls, laughing as they chased one another around stacks of baskets. Their carefree energy made his chest tighten with a sudden longing for home. He wondered whether his younger siblings were playing in the shade of the courtyard now, or whether his mother was kneading dough for the afternoon meal. For a heartbeat, he felt the sting of doubt. Had he made the right choice in leaving? But when he looked around at the caravan, merchants, travelers, volunteers like himself, all moving forward with purpose, that doubt softened. This was life too, stepping into the unknown, trusting that service had its own kind of blessing. After resting, the caravan pressed on. The afternoon heat was heavier than before, a shimmering haze that blurred the horizon. The young man's shoulders ached, and even the camels seemed to move with slower determination. Still, the road felt alive. Wind whispering across the dunes, birds circling high overhead, the constant beat of footsteps. As the sun dipped lower, the landscape shifted subtly. Sand gave way to firmer earth, scattered with thorny shrubs and sharp rocks. And then, almost too faint to notice at first, a line appeared against the horizon. A wall. Ferris shaded his eyes. There, do you see it? That's the frontier city. The young man's heart thumped once, hard. The wall grew clearer with every step, its towers rising like sturdy guardians of the land. Warm light brushed across its surface as the last rays of the sun stretched long and golden. The caravan leader lifted his staff again, voice echoing across the plains. "Prepare yourselves. We arrive before nightfall." A breeze swept over them, carrying the first distant sounds of city life, faint, indistinct, but promising. He straightened his back, feeling a mix of nerves and anticipation. The frontier fortress awaited, and with it, the next chapter of his life. The road narrowed toward the city gates, guiding him gently toward chapter 4. The Ribat fortress was larger than he imagined, far larger than any structure he had ever seen in his oasis town. Its walls, built from sun-baked stone, towered high above the courtyard. Faint traces of repairs showed where storms, time, and perhaps distant raids had left their marks. Torches flickered along the battlements, casting long, wavering shadows that made the fortress feel both alive and ancient. Inside, everything moved with clear purpose. Support workers hurried past with baskets of grain, pots of water, and tools slung over their shoulders. Horses whinnied from the stables near the southern wall, their hooves thudding against packed earth as grooms brushed their coats. The clang of metal echoed from a training field where soldiers practiced sword drills in steady, controlled movements. Their footwork thudded rhythmically, as if marking the heartbeat of the fortress. The young man slowed his steps, absorbing the atmosphere. This was nothing like his quiet oasis, where days passed gently. Here, every sound seemed sharpened, every movement deliberate. Even the wind felt different, colder, touched by distant mountains and wild lands beyond the border. Ferris nudged him lightly. "Feels bigger when you're inside, doesn't it?" He nodded. "I thought frontier life would be quiet." "Oh, it is," Ferris said with a grin. "Just not here." Near the center of the fortress stood a modest masjid. Its walls were simpler than the great mosques of larger cities, but the calligraphy carved into the entrance was beautiful, flowing like water. Lamps glowed warmly from within, and the murmured recitation of Qur'an drifted into the courtyard, softening the harsh lines of the fortress. A group of seasoned veterans stood near the masjid entrance, conversing in low, steady voices. Their armor was worn, patched in places, their expressions calm. They didn't carry themselves like heroes, only like men who had lived long enough to lose their illusions and keep their principles. Nearby, a scholar sat beneath a date palm, teaching a small circle of young soldiers. His voice rose gently above the noise of the courtyard. Knowledge comes before action. The body defends the frontier, but the heart defends the self. The recruits listened with an attentiveness that impressed the young man. Even here, where harshness was expected, learning had its place. A stern but not unkind officer approached the new arrivals. His beard was streaked with gray, and his eyes studied each volunteer with patient scrutiny. "You've come for Rabat service," he said, his voice deep but not loud. "Good. You serve not as conquerors, but as guardians. Remember this." He gestured for them to follow. "We'll assign your quarters and give you time to wash, pray, and rest. Training begins at dawn." The young man walked with the group through a series of stone corridors. The fortress's age showed in its uneven floors and the slight echo of footsteps bouncing off thick walls. Lamps lit the way with warm, flickering circles of light. Their sleeping quarters were simple but clean. Rows of woven mats, clay jugs for water, and hooks for hanging belongings. A small window near the ceiling let in the faint evening breeze. "This will be home for a while," Ferris said, dropping his bundle onto a mat with a relieved sigh. The young man placed his belongings carefully by his chosen spot. The mat was firmer than the one at home. The air carried a hint of sweat and sandalwood. But there was something reassuring in the closeness of the room, the sense of shared purpose. Outside, the night had settled fully. The fortress quieted as soldiers finished their tasks. Distant laughter floated from a corner where cooks were cleaning up from the evening meal. A watchman's footsteps echoed faintly from a tower above, steady and unhurried. The officer dismissed the group with a few final instructions, and the recruits began to settle. Some prayed, others washed. A few sat in silence, adjusting to the reality of their new life. The young man stepped outside for a moment, letting the cool air wash over him. He gazed up at the watchtowers, their silhouettes rising into a starlit sky. Somewhere out there lay the lands he would help guard. Somewhere beyond the darkness, travelers relied on men like him. He felt a quiet resolve settle into his chest. When he returned to the quarters, lamps had been dimmed, and the fortress hummed softly with the sounds of nighttime. He lay down on his mat, letting his breathing and the fortress itself guide him into the unfamiliar rhythm of frontier life. And soon, his first night watch would begin, leading him gently into Chapter 5. The first night comes to him quietly, without ceremony. After a long day of settling into his quarters, storing his few belongings, and receiving simple instructions from an older soldier with a graying beard and a voice like worn leather, he is told that tonight he will observe the night watch. Not to stand guard alone yet, that responsibility comes later, but simply to accompany two experienced men and learn the rhythm of the darkness. And so, as the last light of evening fades from the high walls of the Rabat and the training fields settle into silence, he steps into the cool desert air with a cloak wrapped around his shoulders. The world beyond the gate is not as black as he expected. The moon is half full, bright enough to paint the dunes in soft silver contours. The stars above scatter like grains of white sand across the sky, pulsing gently, as if breathing with him. One of the veterans, a tall man named Ferris, walks ahead with an oil lamp shielded by metal slats that keep its flame from dancing too wildly in the wind. The other, a more talkative soldier named Wab, walks at the rear, humming a quiet tune, something between a lullaby and a prayer. Together, the three of them move along the outer path that circles the fortress walls. At first, the young recruit feels tense. His ears strain for threats, for movement, for anything that might justify the seriousness with which others speak of frontier duty. But the night is gentle tonight. The only sounds are the soft thud of their footsteps in the sand, the occasional chirp of insects hiding among the stones, and the far-off rustle of a small creature, perhaps a fox, perhaps a wandering goat, scavenging for scraps left by travelers. The fortress stands behind them, like a great silent guardian, its watchtowers rising like fingers pointing toward the moon. As they continue, Ferris explains the unspoken rules of night duty, his voice low and steady. "You listen not for danger," he says, "but for changes. The desert has its own heartbeat. When it changes, you pay attention." Wabi adds, "Some nights you hear nothing at all, and that is also something." The two men speak not like warriors, but like shepherds, attuned to a landscape that others pass through without truly seeing. The young recruit relaxes slowly. He notices the way the wind shifts, soft at first, then carrying a hint of coolness from the north. He notices how the air feels different near the stones compared to the open sand. He hears faintly the rhythmic murmur of Qur'an recited by someone on a distant tower, each verse stretched long by the stillness. It feels less like a military duty and more like a quiet communion, a moment in which the world narrows to the simple act of being present. At one point, they stop near a small ridge where the land dips into a shallow valley. Ferris kneels, touching the sand with the back of his hand. The recruit imitates him, expecting some profound revelation. But Ferris only smiles and says, "Cold sand means this place has been empty for a while. No fresh tracks. Good." Wab laughs softly. He expects wolves and raiders on his first night, he says. Let him dream. Soon he will learn that most of Ribat life is waiting, watching, and remembering Allah more than swinging a blade. The young man blushes but smiles. Their warmth, their calm certainty, settles into him like the desert breeze. As the patrol continues, he begins to understand what they meant. The peace of the night is not simply the absence of danger. It is a teacher. A reminder that the frontier is not defined by enemies, but by patience, discipline, and the steady beat of faith beneath the stars. When they complete the circuit and return toward the fortress gate, the recruit feels changed in a small but unmistakable way. The moonlight, the murmured prayers, the slow breathing of the desert, they have woven themselves around him, shaping something new inside. He steps through the gate with a quiet heart, feeling as though he has been invited into a world much deeper than he expected. And as he returns to his quarters, the faint glow of dawn just beginning to tease the horizon. He knows that when morning comes, the calm lessons of the night will give way to the sharp discipline of training. That gentle stillness now prepares him for the next chapter that awaits him with the rising sun. The first rays of dawn slip over the horizon like a hand brushing gently across the earth. And with them comes the rhythm that will shape the young soldier's new life. The fortress wakes before the sun fully rises. Roosters crowing from the small pens behind the kitchens, horses snorting as stable boys begin their early rounds, and the deep, grounding call to prayer rolling softly across the courtyard. After the serenity of his first night watch, he steps into the morning with a sense of quiet anticipation, unaware that the coming days will test him in ways both humbling and transformative. Training begins shortly after Fajr. The recruits gather in a wide open field behind the Ribat, where the sand is packed firm by generations of footprints. Some stand taller, broader. Others look as uncertain as he feels. The instructors, seasoned men with stern faces softened only by sun-worn smiles, walk among them, correcting stances and calling out instructions. Discipline first, one of them announces. Skill comes later, strength grows last. But discipline must be in you from the start. Their mornings begin with walking. Long, seemingly endless laps around the fortress walls, paced not for speed, but for endurance. The young man quickly learns that Ribat soldiers do not rush unless necessary. They conserve their energy for times when it truly matters. At first, his legs ache terribly. His breath shortens by the third lap. Around him, others struggle too, but slowly, day by day, their steps become steadier. Their breathing becomes quieter. The walks become a form of meditation, a moving prayer stitched into the routine of their lives. After walking, they move to archery. Rows of wooden targets are set against a high protective wall. The veteran in charge, an elderly archer named Rasht with a voice like a soft drum, shows them how to hold the bow properly. The young recruit fumbles constantly. His arrows wobble crookedly, striking the ground far short of the target. Rasht says nothing harsh. He simply adjusts the boy's elbow, lifts his shoulder, and reminds him, "Patience in your breath. Your arrow flies the way your heart rests." By the 5th day, the boy is hitting the outer edge of the target. By the 10th, he strikes near the center at least once each session. Each small improvement builds a quiet pride inside him. The afternoons shift to horse care. The fortress stables hold animals trained for endurance rather than battle. Lean desert horses with sharp, alert eyes. Learning to clean their hooves, brush their coats, and feed them properly becomes another layer of discipline. The young recruit is nervous at first, unsure how to approach their enormous bodies. But the stable master, a calm man named Idris, teaches him that horses understand intention more than strength. "If you respect them," he says, "they will carry you farther than your feet ever could." Gradually, the horses begin to recognize the recruit's scent and voice. One chestnut mare occasionally nudges his shoulder when he approaches, and though her gesture is small, it fills him with warmth. Then there is sparring, perhaps the most humbling part of all. Wooden swords clack against each other under the bright midday sun, as pairs of young men practice the same basic movements over and over again. At first, he is clumsy. His blocks are late, his footing uncertain. More than once, he stumbles back into the dust and feels his cheeks burn with embarrassment. But the instructors teach them not to chase victory. "We are not here to win," one says. "We are here to endure." A man who endures is harder to defeat than a man who swings wildly. With time, he finds a rhythm, steady steps, careful breath, controlled movements. His arms strengthen, his speed improves. And though he still loses more matches than he wins, he no longer falls easily. Among the instructors and seasoned fighters moving through the courtyard, one figure begins to stand out to him. A tall veteran with a distinctive limp, his beard streaked with silver, his eyes gentle but piercing. The man watches the recruits quietly at first, correcting someone's posture here, offering a word of encouragement there. His presence commands respect without needing to raise his voice. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling sparring session, the veteran approaches the young recruit. He studies him for a moment, then adjusts the boy's stance with a careful tap to his foot. "You learn slowly," the man says, "but you learn well. Slow roots make strong trees." The recruit feels a strange mixture of surprise and gratitude. No instructor has spoken to him so personally yet. "My name is Hamza," the veteran offers. "I will be watching your progress." Those words settle into the young man like an oath, or perhaps an invitation. As he returns to his quarters that evening, exhausted but steady, he senses that the presence of this mentor will shape him in the weeks ahead. And with the coming dawn, their paths will begin to intertwine, leading him gently into the next chapter of his journey. The days begin to take on a rhythm: training at dawn, work through the heat, reflection in the cool evenings. But it is the afternoons with the older warriors that begin to shape him in ways deeper than muscle or technique. After noticing the young recruit's steady, quiet determination, Hamza invites him to join a small circle that gathers each evening near the courtyard well. These men are not the loud storytellers who boast after supper, nor the hardened trainers who bark instructions across the yard. They are something else entirely. Calm, deliberate, anchored. He approaches them hesitantly the first time. They sit in the shade of a low stone archway, their cloaks spread neatly on the ground. A clay jug of water rests at the center, covered with a damp cloth to keep it cool. Hamza gestures for him to join, and the others nod in greeting, their eyes warm but observant. For a while, no one speaks. They simply sit together, listening to the wind move across the courtyard and the distant sounds of recruits finishing their chores. Then, at last, one of the elders, a thin man named Suhail, with a scar running from his cheek to his jaw, begins to speak. Young men come here thinking jihad is a clash of blades, he says softly, almost as if addressing the wind. But most of our battles are with our own hearts. The blade is the last thing we ever wish to raise. Another elder, rounder and slower in movement, adds, "Our duty is to protect caravans, villages, travelers. Most days, that means clearing a path, guiding a lost merchant, or refusing anger when someone insults you." He chuckles. "If you can master your temper, you have already won half the war." The recruit listens intently. He has heard the word jihad spoken before, at home, in sermons, in lessons, at the masjid, but it always felt heavy, distant, almost too big for him to grasp. Now, spoken by these men, it sounds different, quieter, steadier, rooted in inward struggle and patient service rather than glory or force. Hamza leans forward slightly. "Do you know why ribat is considered a noble task?" he asks the young man. He shakes his head. "Because it requires presence," Hamza says. "Not in battles, those are rare, but in waiting, in holding a line so others may sleep in peace, in being steady even when nothing happens. That is harder for most men than fighting." Another evening, the lesson shifts. Suhail tells a story about a long journey across the western deserts many years before. The caravan he accompanied had lost its guide in a sandstorm, and it fell to him, a young soldier then, to lead them through a week of scorching days and freezing nights. The only enemies they faced were thirst and fear. "I learned then," he says, "that courage is not loud, it is quiet. A man who keeps walking when his legs tremble. He is braver than one who shouts on the battlefield." The recruit feels these words settle heavily inside him. He has always imagined courage as something bright and bold, but now he sees it as something simple, almost invisible. On another evening, the elders discuss patience. The oldest among them, a man named Man, whose beard is as white as fresh flour, speaks the least, but carries a presence like a sturdy pillar. "Patience," he tells the recruit one night, "is the root of obedience, and obedience to Allah is the root of all strength. If you can stand firm in quiet faith, you will not fear any man." Sometimes they speak of past campaigns, not through boastful triumphs, but through the lessons they carried from them. They talk of long marches, unexpected kindnesses from strangers, companions lost to illness, nights spent navigating by stars that seemed too distant to care. Each story builds a picture of frontier life that is vast, difficult, but strangely noble. The young man begins looking forward to these gatherings more than anything else. Training strengthens his body, but these conversations shape something deeper, his sense of purpose. His nights grow quieter, his frustrations softer, He finds himself thinking before reacting, breathing before speaking, listening more than assuming. The fortress, once overwhelming, now feels like a place where he is being slowly carved into something meaningful. One night, after a particularly thoughtful discussion on self-control, Hamza places a hand on his shoulder and says, "Your time to put these lessons to use will come sooner than you think." The young recruit senses something shifting. The veterans exchange certain glances, subtle but unmistakable. A small ripple of anticipation moves through the group, though no one names it yet. As he walks back to his quarters under the silver glow of the moon, he feels the first hints of responsibility settling around him, gentle but firm. Tomorrow, he knows, will not be just another day of drills and chores. Something is coming, his first real assignment, and the quiet wisdom of the old warriors has prepared his heart to meet it. The morning after Hamza's quiet warning arrives with a restless kind of stillness, as if the fortress itself is holding its breath. The young recruit wakes before the call to prayer, sensing something different in the air. When he reaches the courtyard, a small assembly has already formed. Officers, a few seasoned soldiers, and several men he recognizes from the supply stables. In the center stand three merchants with dust-coated cloaks and travel-worn expressions. An officer reads a brief order from the regional governor's seal. A caravan of goods, grain, cloth, medicinal herbs, is to be escorted through a stretch of desert known for sudden storms and occasional bandit raids. The route is essential. Villages depend on these supplies. A small team from the Ribat will accompany them. His name is called. A tightness forms in his chest. Not fear exactly, something closer to the weight of responsibility settling into place. He steps forward, receives a nod of approval, and feels the elder's lessons echo inside him. Quiet duty, calm presence, patience. The preparations begin quickly. Horses are checked for fit saddles. Water skins are counted and refilled. Spare arrows are bundled and tied to saddle loops. The merchants organize their camels, each loaded with goods wrapped in thick woolen cloth. The sun has barely risen, yet the air hums with purposeful energy. Before mounting his horse, the recruit spots Hamza watching from the shade of a wall. The old warrior gives him a simple nod. No speech, no advice. Just a look that says, "You are ready for this." And somehow, that is enough. The caravan sets off with the low groans of camels and the rhythmic clopping of hooves against hard-packed sand. The fortress shrinks behind them until it becomes only a smudge on the horizon. The open desert stretches ahead, wide, pale, and shimmering with heat even in early morning. Hours pass. The sun climbs higher. Sweat gathers under the young man's helmet and trickles down his neck. Still, the rhythm of travel becomes almost meditative. The steady creak of saddle leather, the rustle of wind across dunes, the occasional grunt of a camel shifting its load. The soldiers ride in a loose formation, staying close enough to protect, but far enough to survey. By midday, they stop at a cluster of thorny shrubs where a small spring lies hidden beneath the sand. The merchants kneel in gratitude. Finding such springs can be dangerous if approached alone. The soldiers take turns filling water skins, one always standing guard. As they continue, the land begins to change. The dunes smooth out into flatter plains where rocks jut like broken teeth. Their leader, a middle-aged soldier named Ferris, raises his hand. Everyone halts. He points toward a faint series of prints in the sand. Fresh, irregular, too many to belong to wandering herders. Bandits passed here last night, Ferris murmurs. Not close, but not far. The merchants exchange worried looks. The young recruit feels his pulse quicken, but he keeps his breathing slow, remembering Suhail's words. Courage is quiet. They adjust their formation, soldiers forming a protective ring around the caravan. For several tense miles, every sound seems sharper. A crow's caw echoes like a warning. A shifting pebble feels like a sign of movement, but the trail eventually bends away toward a distant ridge, and the tension slowly eases. Still, the lesson remains. Vigilance without panic. On the third afternoon, a sudden sandstorm rolls in from the west. The sky darkens into a swirling copper haze. The wind rises with a howl that makes even the camels groan. Ferris shouts for everyone to cover their faces and stay close. The storm hits with a ferocity that seems alive, sand whipping into every crease of clothing, reducing the world to a blur of red dust. The young recruit grips his reins, guiding his horse step by step beside a trembling merchant. Visibility shrinks to almost nothing. He recalls Mon's lesson on patience and holds steady, knowing panic is more dangerous than the storm itself. The soldiers cluster tightly, using their cloaks to shield the merchants until, slowly, the storm begins to pass. When the sky clears, the world feels washed clean. The caravan continues, shaken but intact. That night, they rest behind a low ridge, lighting no fires to avoid attracting attention. Under the silence of the stars, the recruit feels something subtle but powerful shift inside him. A quiet confidence born not from triumph, but from endurance. The final leg of the journey brings them through a narrow valley where cliffs rise on either side. Birds circle overhead. The merchants murmur prayers. But the day passes peacefully, and by late afternoon, the walls of a frontier city appear in the distance, shimmering like a mirage. When the caravan reaches its gates, the merchants fall to their knees in gratitude. Ferris claps the young recruit on the back. You kept your heart steady. That's the hardest part. As they unload the goods and hand over the official ledger, the recruit notices a group of scholars entering the city's small masjid, robes flowing, scrolls tucked under their arms. Their presence feels like a soft contrast to the rough journey he just endured. Knowledge, worship, reflection, life on the frontier is not only sand and storms, and as the soldiers make their way toward their temporary lodging, the young man senses that, after this first mission, a different kind of learning waits just ahead. The return journey to the fortress is quieter than the one that carried them out. The merchant's grateful farewells still echo in the young recruit's ears, and the dust of the storm still clings to the folds of his cloak. Yet as the Rabat's walls rise again on the horizon, solid, familiar, steadfast, he feels something softened inside him, as though the desert itself has sanded down the rough edges of his uncertainty. Life at the fortress resumes with its usual rhythm: dawn prayers, morning drills, midday chores. But on the second day after their return, a new presence enters the fortress courtyard. A tall man with a gentle posture, wrapped in a deep indigo robe that sways with the breeze. He carries no weapons, only a leather satchel of scrolls hangs at his side. Whispers travel quickly. A scholar has arrived from a distant city, sent by the governor to teach tafsir, hadith, and matters of law to the soldiers stationed at the frontier. For many, the news brings a smile. For others, a shrug. But for the young recruit, still carrying the weight of the desert, the storm, and the quiet fear he had learned to contain, something in him stirs with a need he cannot fully name. The classes begin that very evening in the small, open-air prayer courtyard. The soldiers sit on woven mats while lanterns flicker along the walls. The scholar introduces himself as Sheikh Idris, his voice calm, like a stream moving over polished stones. He speaks not with the booming projection of a preacher, but with the soft, steady tone of someone who expects his words to settle naturally where they belong. Strength, he begins, is a blessing. But strength without knowledge becomes a burden, and knowledge without humility becomes a poison. The sentence falls into the courtyard like a cool shadow. The young recruit feels it wash over him. The sheikh begins his lessons with tafsir, explaining verses the soldiers have recited since childhood, but never deeply understood. He speaks of patience, of gratitude, of the unseen ways Allah guards those who guard others. He draws connections between revelation and the lives of ordinary people, farmers, travelers, shepherds, guards on the frontier. You stand on the edges of the realm, Sheikh Idris tells them, but do not let your heart stand on the edge of your faith. Fill them, strengthen them. A soldier's shield is not only wood and leather, it is what he carries in his chest. The young recruit listens with an intensity he has never felt in any classroom. The scholar's explanations crack open familiar verses, revealing a depth that humbles him. Suddenly, he realizes how limited his world had been. Training, chores, fear, hope, discipline. Now, there are entire oceans of meaning he never knew he had access to. After tafsir comes hadith. The sheikh recites traditions gently, explaining their context, their authenticity, their wisdom. He reminds the soldiers that the Prophet's greatest acts of bravery were rooted in mercy, restraint, and truthfulness. Courage, he says one night, is not in striking. It is in knowing when not to strike, when to forgive, when to walk away, when to breathe deeply and trust that Allah sees what others do not. These words strike the recruit harder than any blow from the training yard. He remembers the sandstorm, how he held steady beside a terrified merchant. He remembers the trail of bandit footsteps, how he kept calm though his pulse raced. He remembers Hamza's lessons, Suhail's stories, Man's quiet wisdom. All of it seems to point toward what the scholar is now describing, a strength rooted not in force, but in presence. Every evening, the lessons continue, even when fatigue drags heavily on the soldier's limbs. After long drills, the recruit washes quickly and hurries to the courtyard, determined not to miss a word. Something opens in him, an inner world he never explored before. He finds himself reflecting during patrol, reciting verses while grooming his horse, whispering prayers before sleep. A calm begins to take root where uncertainty once lived. As days turn into weeks, the sheikh begins teaching basic law, rules of honesty in trade, justice in disputes, kindness toward travelers, the rights of neighbors, the responsibilities of guardians. Many soldiers are surprised by how deeply Islamic law concerns itself with ordinary life rather than warfare. This, Sheikh Idris says, lifting a scroll, is also jihad, choosing truth when lies are easier, fairness when selfishness is tempting, discipline when neglect feels simpler. The recruit feels something shift inside him. The lessons do not merely inform him, they rearrange him. They give structure to his scattered fears and clarity to his muddled hopes. He begins to see the ribat not only as a place of duty, but as a place of worship, service, and growth. One evening, after class ends and the lanterns are being extinguished, the scholar stops him with a gentle gesture. "You listen with your whole heart," Sheikh Idris says. "Not many do that." The recruit lowers his gaze, unsure how to respond. "Do not ignore the stirrings inside you," the scholar continues. "When Allah softens a heart, it is because He wants to fill it." That night, as he walks back to his quarters, the fortress feels quieter than usual. The stars above seem brighter, closer. Each breath feels deeper, slower. Something is growing inside him, not ambition, not pride, but a kind of stillness. A stillness that prepares him for the transformation waiting just ahead in chapter 10, the night, thinned slowly into the pale breath of dawn. And as the first shimmer of light touched the stone walls of the fortress, he found himself lingering in the quiet courtyard, long after the others had gone. The scholar's words still rested somewhere deep inside him, gentle, heavy, impossible to ignore. He felt as though a door had been opened, not by force, but by the steady patience of knowledge itself. And so, instead of returning to the barracks, he turned toward the small prayer alcove near the eastern wall, drawn to it by a feeling he could not yet name. He spread his cloak across the cool ground and stood in the soft half-light. There was no wind, no footsteps, no sound except the faint hum of the waking desert. His heart beat with a slow clarity that surprised him. When he raised his hands and began to pray, the world seemed to narrow into a single moment, unbroken, untouched, luminous. As he bowed, something loosened inside him, as though a knot he had always carried had quietly untied itself. In sujud, his forehead pressed against the earth, he felt the strange, overwhelming nearness of his own smallness. The scholar's reminder echoed in him. Knowledge without humility is a tree without fruit. He had heard many lessons before, but that one had followed him, weaving into his thoughts like a thread pulled through fabric. And here, bowed in stillness, he realized he no longer wanted to be brave in the way he once imagined. He wanted to be sincere, to be upright, to be worthy. He lingered there a long time, whispering prayers he did not know he remembered, asking for strength not of the sword, but of the soul. The warmth rising in the sky touched the fortress stones, turning them gold, and he watched that light spill slowly across the courtyard. It felt like something inside him was turning with it, something tender, something alive. When he finally sat back on his heels, he looked down at his hands. These were hands trained to grip a spear, to raise a shield, to fight alongside brothers in defense of distant borders. But now, he wondered what else they were meant to hold. Mercy? Patience? Wisdom? He wasn't sure yet, but he felt the question settle into him like a seed. He remembered the scholar explaining how the earliest battles were never merely clashes of armies. They were tests of character, of restraint, of compassion, even toward one's opponent. That thought alone had unsettled him for days, and now, as he watched the sunrise spread across the desert plain below the walls, he felt a quiet shift, the turning of the heart toward something deeper than valor. He thought of his mother's gentle voice as she woke him for prayer in their modest home. He thought of the way his younger siblings laughed as they chased goats along the dusty paths. He thought of the old well near their garden, how the rope creaked every time he pulled up a bucket. Memories he had pushed aside in the rush of training and duty began returning with warmth rather than distraction. It was as if, in this dawn stillness, something was urging him not to forget his beginning, even as he stepped into a new future. He drew his knees up and rested his arms on them, gazing at the faint outline of distant hills. The fortress behind him felt different now, not just a place of discipline and preparation, but a place where his soul was being shaped in ways he had never expected. He realized he was no longer the boy who arrived months ago with restless ambition. He was becoming quieter inside, steadier, more aware of the weight of every choice. A soft breeze rose, carrying with it the subtle scent of sand warming in the early sun. He breathed it in slowly. Something within him softened even further. He felt aligned, almost, as though the long journey, from home to training grounds to scholarly lessons, was guiding him toward a purpose much larger than his own desires. When footsteps stirred behind him, he didn't turn immediately. It was only when the muezzin's voice began to rise, calling the fortress to greet the new day, that he stood again. He brushed the dust from his cloak and let the final echoes of his reflection settle quietly in his chest. The call washed over the walls, rolling out across the desert like a gentle tide, and with it came a familiar ache. A memory tugged at him, soft but persistent, the sound of the same call drifting through his village at dawn, waking the rooftops one by one. It struck him with unexpected longing, and he knew, without needing to name it, that his thoughts were beginning to find their way back home. And as the sun lifted fully over the horizon, he stepped away from the prayer alcove, carrying with him the beginnings of a transformation that would soon lead him to confront the one thing he had been trying not to feel for months, the pull of home itself. The courtyard was warm by the time he finished his morning duties, but something in him still carried the cool hush of dawn. The feeling lingered as he walked along the inner wall, his thoughts drifting again and again toward home. It was strange how a single quiet prayer could pull open an entire landscape of memories. And as he passed the cluster of small rooms near the administrative hall, he paused, catching sight of the fortress scribe seated at his low wooden desk, sorting through a stack of parchment. The scribe looked up, his thin face marked by ink stains and calm patience. "You've been meaning to write to your family, haven't you?" he said, as though he had been expecting him. The young soldier blinked, surprised. Perhaps it was written plainly across his face, the longing he could no longer ignore. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. If you have time today," the scribe gestured for him to sit. "For a letter home," he said, "there is always time." The young man lowered himself onto the small cushion opposite the desk. The parchment on the table was fresh and smooth, its pale surface waiting. The scribe dipped his reed pen into ink, but before writing, he looked at him intently, "Speak from your heart," he said. "I will shape the words." And just like that, the weight in his chest began to loosen. He started slowly, unsure where to begin. His voice wavered as he described the fortress, the cold training fields, the heat of midday drills, the sense of brotherhood, the discipline, the long nights spent polishing armor beneath lantern light. The scribe wrote with steady strokes, preserving every hesitation, every glance away, every exhale. But when he began speaking of home, the words came easier. He told them he prayed under the same sky they did. He told them he had not forgotten the smell of their hearth, or the rhythm of their footsteps, or the way his mother tapped the side of a clay bowl when she was thinking. He described the kindness of his companions, the wisdom of the visiting scholar, the lessons that had changed him in quiet, subtle ways. And then, finally, he allowed himself to say what he had been avoiding, that he missed them, not in passing, but with a steady ache that lived beneath his ribs. His voice cracked then, not from weakness, but from release. The scribe paused, but did not look up. Instead, he waited, the tip of his pen resting lightly against the parchment, patient as the desert. After a long breath, the young soldier continued. He asked about the harvest. He wondered aloud whether his little sister still chased birds away from the fig trees. He hoped his younger brother was studying hard. He sent greetings to neighbors and elders. He reassured them, reassured his mother especially, that he was safe, that the commanders were just, that the men he served beside were honorable. He hoped these words would ease the worry that surely shadowed her prayers. When he finished, the scribe blew gently across the ink and rolled the parchment with careful precision. He tied it with a simple cord before handing it over. "Give it to the courier," he said. "He leaves at dusk." The young man held the letter with both hands, as though it were something fragile or sacred. For a moment, he did not move. He simply stared at the rolled parchment, feeling the presence of his family settle around him like a warm cloak. He left the scribe's room slowly, almost reluctantly, and made his way toward the small stable where the couriers prepared their mounts. The sun was beginning its descent, turning the sky into streaks of amber. The courier took the letter with a nod, tucked it into a leather pouch, and promised it would reach the next caravan heading toward his village. And just like that, the letter was gone, carried away into the vast distance he could not cross himself. As evening came, he found himself sitting alone at the top of the watchtower, watching the desert stretch into endless shadow. The fortress below buzzed with the usual rhythm, men eating, laughing, preparing for night duty. But he felt suspended, as though the world had slowed around him. He imagined the courier riding across the plains, the letter jostling with every movement. He imagined the caravan receiving it, carrying it mile after mile. And he imagined, most vividly of all, his mother opening it with trembling fingers, reading his words again and again by lamplight. The thought filled him with both comfort and ache. Days passed, then more days. Training resumed, duties rotated, and the fortress settled back into its steady rhythm. But a quiet thread of anticipation began to weave itself through every morning, every sunset. Each time a messenger arrived, he felt his pulse quicken. Each time one rode away, disappointment tugged at him softly. Waiting became its own test, one that chipped at his patience, shaped his hope, and taught him the slow discipline of trust. And as another week faded beneath the desert sun, he didn't yet know it. But this waiting, this longing suspended in time, would carry him straight into the next turning of his journey, guiding him toward a chapter shaped not by swords or prayer, but by the hope of a reply carried across miles of sand. Night settled over the fortress like a soft cloak, dimming the last traces of gold along the horizon. One by one, lanterns were lit across the courtyard, their warm glow flickering against the mud brick walls. The young soldier finished his duties for the evening, washed the dust from his hands, and drifted toward the smell of roasting barley bread and the low hum of voices rising from the central fire pit. It was a familiar scene by now, an unofficial gathering that happened most nights when the wind was calm and no patrols were scheduled. Someone always brought a pot of spiced milk, another carried a small drum, and someone else dragged out a dented kettle that never quite boiled evenly. The men gathered around the flames, not out of duty, but out of something gentler, the need to feel human at the edge of the empire. He slipped into the circle quietly, settling between a wiry horse handler from Kufa and a broad-shouldered spearman whose laughter shook the ground. The fire snapped softly, sending sparks spinning up into the cool desert sky, where stars hung like silver beads threaded across a dark cloth. A few of the younger recruits were already trading exaggerated stories, one swearing he had once outrun a wolf, another insisting he had wrestled a camel that refused to kneel. The others laughed, tossing dates at them and telling them to stop lying so boldly. Then came the more serious tales. A gentle-faced man from Yemen spoke of his orchards back home, terraced fields where rain came soft and frequent, nothing like the vast dry plains surrounding the fortress. He described the taste of the fruit, the way children used to race down narrow paths between the trees. As he spoke, his voice softened, and for a moment, everyone could almost smell the cool earth and ripening figs. Next, a tall soldier with a scar across his eyebrow spoke of his younger brother, who dreamed of traveling eastward to lands full of spices the color of fire. The men listened quietly as he admitted he hadn't written home in months. Their silence carried understanding rather than judgment. The young soldier found himself relaxing, the warmth of the fire sinking into his bones. These men, some weary, some loud, some quiet, felt less like distant strangers and more like threads binding together the strange new fabric of his life. After a while, the rhythmic tapping of a drum began, slow, steady, as if mimicking the heartbeat of the desert. A few men clapped along. Others simply rested on their elbows, staring into the flames as though searching for memories tucked inside the shifting embers. Then, one of the veterans cleared his throat. He was an older man, with sun-worn skin and a beard streaked with gray. The others called him Abu Khalid. He didn't speak often, but when he did, even the rowdiest men grew quiet. Tonight was no different. He stretched out his legs, leaned forward toward the fire, and began his story without preamble. It was during my first year on the frontier, he said, when the nights felt colder and the winds sounded like voices. The young soldier felt the men shift slightly closer. Everyone knew that Abu Khalid's stories were always wrapped in truth, even if the edges were softened by age. We were stationed further northeast then, he continued, near a river that never ran dry. The border was quiet, too quiet perhaps. No battles, no raids, no caravans passing by. Just silence. But silence on the frontier, he said, lifting his eyes, is never empty. He paused, letting the meaning settle. One night, just before dawn, we saw dust rising on the far horizon. Thought it was nothing. Wind can play tricks out there, but it wasn't the wind. It was riders, scouts from the outer villages fleeing south. A stillness fell over the circle. Even the fire seemed to lean in. Abu Khalid took another breath, his gaze fixed on the flames. They said some tribes were gathering in the northern passes, small groups at first, but restless, hungry, desperate, and in desperation, he added quietly, men make dangerous decisions. The young soldier felt something shift inside him. The warmth of the fire remained, but a small thread of tension wound itself through the air. What happened? Someone finally asked. The older man shrugged. Nothing at first. Weeks passed, maybe months. But the signs were there. Strangers asking too many questions in the oasis towns. Traders traveling with armed escorts. Border outposts sending fewer messages. He tossed a twig into the fire and watched it curl into ash. Not everything becomes a battle, he said, but everything begins as a whisper. For a moment, the fire was the only sound. Then someone exhaled, breaking the tension, and the circle slowly eased back into warmth. A few jokes were cracked. Someone offered dried apricots, and the drum resumed its steady rhythm. Laughter returned, softer this time, but genuine. Yet the young soldier could not shake the subtle warning in Abu Khalid's words. Something distant, something quiet, seemed to be stirring beyond the borders. And though life at the fortress continued as usual, the story left a small ripple in his thoughts, one that would not entirely fade. As the fire dimmed and men rose to return to their quarters, he walked slowly back toward his sleeping mat under the watchtower. The sky above remained calm, wide, unbothered. But he felt the chapter turning beneath it, felt the ground shifting gently towards something new. Unseen, but approaching. Quiet, but coming. And it would lead him into the next morning, the next duty, and directly into the brewing tension waiting at the edge of Chapter 13. The morning after Abu Khalid's story felt different, though nothing in the fortress had visibly changed. The same routines carried on, the clang of practice shields, the scrape of brooms across the courtyard, the low murmur of men preparing for their duties. Yet beneath it all was a faint, almost imperceptible tension, like a thread pulled just slightly taut. The young soldier felt it too. During drills, he caught men glancing at the northern horizon more than usual. During breakfast, a quiet unease hung in the air. Even the commander, normally composed and unreadable, stood a little longer than usual at the watchtower stairs, scanning the dunes. It was a calm day, too calm, some whispered. And calmness, on the frontier, often meant the world was clearing its throat before speaking. By midday, the sun blazed fiercely overhead. The young soldier had just finished cleaning tack in the stable when the call came. Not a full alarm, but a sharp whistle from the lookout post. Short, controlled, intentional. The fortress stirred at once, Men moved quickly to their stations, not running, not panicking, just shifting into the disciplined pattern drilled into them every morning. The young soldier hurried to the outer wall, gripping his spear tight enough for his knuckles to pale. His heartbeat thudded unevenly, not loud, but persistent. When he reached the top, he finally saw what the lookout had spotted: movement on the far side of the dunes. Small shadows, maybe 10, 12, no formation, no banners. Just scattered figures approaching with the nervous energy of men testing limits. Bandits. Not an army, not a raid. Just a probing group, the kind that preyed on caravans and tested frontier posts to see how quickly they reacted. The commander stepped forward, calm as a still pool. Hold positions. No arrows unless ordered. Watch their movement. The young soldier swallowed, adjusting his stance, trying to steady his breathing. Beside him, a veteran murmured, "First time?" He nodded. The man offered a faint, reassuring smile. "Good. You'll remember every detail, but not for the reasons you think." Below, the bandits crept closer, their mismatched weapons glinting in the sun. They weren't charging, they were watching, waiting to see whether the fortress would flinch. "Archers," the commander called softly. "Ready?" The bowstrings tightened, humming in the stillness. The young soldier felt sweat slide down his spine. The desert seemed to hold its breath. When the bandits were close enough to gauge the walls, one of them raised a hand, maybe to signal retreat, maybe to challenge. But another, more reckless, let out a shout and sprinted forward. It happened quickly. An arrow thudded into the sand near his feet, deliberately missing. A warning. The man stumbled, startled, and the rest froze. The commander raised his hand again. Second warning! Another arrow, this one grazing a rider's saddle. The group hesitated, shifting uneasily. One shouted something unintelligible over the wind. Another pointed irritably back toward the dunes. They began to pull away, but in confusion or stubbornness, one of them swung his sling and released a stone. It cracked against the outer wall with a sharp clack. The commander's voice dropped. "Shields!" The young soldier brought his shield up, just as a second stone flew. The bandits, perhaps realizing they had crossed a line, scattered and hurled a few more half-hearted projectiles before turning fully and sprinting back across the sand. It wasn't a battle, not even close. It was messy, haphazard, and fast. More a gust of trouble than a storm. But fear had been real. The tension real. The brief flash of danger enough to leave a mark. The archers did not fire again. The bandits disappeared over the dunes, leaving the desert strangely quiet. The quiet afterward was the worst part. Heavy, uneven. A silence that clung to the skin. The commander allowed no celebration. There was nothing to celebrate. Instead, he ordered a survey of the wall and checked for injuries. Only one man had been hurt. A recruit struck in the forearm by a ricocheted stone. It wasn't deep, but he winced as blood trickled down his wrist. The young soldier helped carry him toward the infirmary, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from his limbs. His legs shook, not from exhaustion, but from the raw, unfamiliar aftershock of fear. Inside the small healing room, the fortress medic greeted them with steady hands and a frown of concentration. He guided the injured man to a stool, pulling out cloth, herbs, and a pot of boiled water. "You see?" The veteran from earlier murmured beside him. Battles don't always roar. Sometimes they whisper. Sometimes they barely breathe. The young soldier nodded, still shaken. And afterward, the man added, patting his shoulder, is when you feel the weight most. The medic cleaned the wound carefully, speaking in a calm tone that seemed designed not just to heal, but to steady. The others gathered near the doorway, not crowding the injured man, but maintaining a respectful presence, as though reminding him he wasn't alone. The young soldier watched, absorbing the quiet compassion in the room. The fear of the encounter began to settle. Not vanish, but settle, like dust finding its place after being stirred. As the bandaged recruit exhaled, and the medic prepared salve for the swelling, the young soldier felt the chapter of his life shift once again. The skirmish had been small, but its lesson was large. Danger here was not dramatic. It was subtle, sudden, real. And the healing that followed, the tending of wounds, the steady hands, the soft voices, was just as much a part of frontier life as the tension of watchtowers. As he stepped out into the late afternoon light, the young soldier sensed that this quiet moment, this transition from fear to care, would lead him gently into the next chapter, where the work of mending, comforting, and rebuilding awaited in chapter 14. The infirmary always smelled faintly of crushed leaves and warm water, an earthy, comforting scent that softened even the harshest days. After the skirmish, the soldiers filed in and out with low voices, carrying not panic, but a quiet sense of duty. The fortress was calm again, but the echo of danger still lingered in the corners of the young soldier's mind. He felt it like a tremor beneath the skin, subtle yet insistent. Inside, the medics moved with a rhythm that looked almost like worship. They weren't warriors, yet their work carried a kind of bravery that felt deeper than standing on the battlements. One bent over the injured recruit with slow, deliberate care, rinsing the wound with warm water. Another prepared a paste of ground leaves and resin, murmuring a brief prayer under his breath as he mixed. The young soldier stood nearby holding a jug, waiting for instruction. He wasn't injured, but it felt wrong to simply walk away after the tension of the morning. Something within him, perhaps the lingering tremor, perhaps something softer, urged him to stay. "Bring more water," one of the medics said without looking up. "Enough to keep the bowl warm." He nodded and slipped out to the courtyard. The desert sun had begun its late afternoon descent, turning the stone floor gold. At the well, he lowered the bucket, listening to the rope creak. As he pulled it up, a soft splash echoed off the walls, a sound that reminded him of home, of the courtyard where his mother washed dates, of the basin where he used to scrub dust from his hands after tending animals. When he returned, the injured recruit gave him a weak smile, trying to hide the fear still trembling behind his eyes. "Does it hurt much?" the young soldier asked quietly. "Only when I breathe," the recruit joked, badly, but earnestly. One of the medics chuckled under his breath. "He will live. The stone barely broke the skin, but fear bruises deeper than flesh." The recruit swallowed. The joke faded. His gaze drifted to the young soldier. "Did your hand shake too?" he asked. The question struck deeper than expected. The young soldier hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes, mine still do." That honesty seemed to ease something in the injured man's shoulders. The medic finished applying the herbal paste, binding it with clean cloth. These wounds are simple, he said, tightening the knot. Time and rest will heal them. But the fear behind them. He looked at both young men. That needs gentler medicine. The young soldier helped the recruit sit upright. They moved slowly, carefully, as if shifting a valuable pottery bowl. The medic's eyes softened. Stay with him a while, he said. Talk to him. Keep him awake until sunset. The mind heals best with company. So he stayed. They sat together near the narrow window, where a strip of sunlight fell across the floor like a warm ribbon. The fortress hummed faintly with evening chores, buckets being filled, sandals brushing stone, someone reciting a quiet verse while sweeping. The recruit's breathing steadied little by little. The young soldier dipped a cloth in water and handed it to him. Hold this to your forehead, he suggested. The heat will pass soon. The recruit obeyed, sighing in relief. Thank you, he murmured. I thought today would end differently. So did I, the young soldier replied. A stretch of silence followed, not heavy, just reflective. Through the window, the desert breeze carried the scent of sage and distant cooking fires. The sky was warming into its evening colors. Soft rose, pale amber, the purple that always came just before dusk. After some time, the medic returned to check the bandage. He ran gentle fingers along the cloth, feeling for heat or swelling. Satisfied, he dipped his head in a small nod. You'll be fine, he said, but rest tonight. No guard shift. The recruit exhaled in relief. As the medic walked away, the young soldier looked around the room. The shelves of herbs, the stacks of clean cloth, the bowls of water slowly cooling. There was a stillness here that didn't exist in the courtyard or the tower or the training field. Here, even the air moved differently, slower, kinder. Helping the wounded, he realized, was not simply a task. It was a reminder of vulnerability, of fragility, of the delicate thread that tied all of them, veterans, recruits, scholars, even commanders, to the same human core. And that thread tugged softly at his heart. Later, when he stepped out into the courtyard, the sun was sinking low. Shadows stretched long across the stone, and the sky glowed with the promise of another peaceful night. But inside him, the day's events stirred slowly, forming quiet questions. He felt the weight of life's fragility, how quickly a stone could pierce skin, how easily breath could tremble, how fear could settle deep into the bones. The bandits had retreated, and the fortress was safe for now. But something within him had shifted. As he walked toward the prayer hall, the hush of evening settling around him like a cloak, he sensed the next chapter rising gently ahead. An inward turn, a deeper contemplation. The wounded had been tended. Now came the reflection on what it meant to be breakable. And so, carried softly by the dusk, he slipped naturally into the beginnings of chapter 15. The courtyard was nearly empty by the time he reached it. Only 2 soldiers remained, sweeping sand from the prayer hall steps, their motions slow and unhurried. The sky above them had deepened into a soft indigo, the kind that made the first stars feel bright enough to hear. The quiet wrapped itself around the fortress like a shawl, calming and cool. But inside the young soldier, there was still movement, thoughts shifting like dunes, memories rising like wind-blown grains. He walked to the far side of the courtyard and sat beneath a date palm, whose fronds rustled gently overhead. For a long moment, he simply breathed, letting the stillness settle over him. Yet not even the steady rhythm of the breeze could push away the image of the injured recruit. The pale face, the trembling hands, the weak smile trying so hard to be brave. It wasn't the wound itself that lingered. It was the reminder. Fragility. His mind drifted, uninvited, to verses he had memorized years before, recited in quiet lessons beside his local imam back home. Every soul shall taste death. He had known the words. He had believed them. But believing something in the calm safety of an oasis town was different from feeling it echo through your bones after watching someone bleed just an arm's length away. Suddenly the words felt heavier, sharper, real. The desert night grew cooler around him. A soft wind brushed his face, carrying with it the scent of earth and distant cooking hearths. In the road beyond the walls, a camel bell tinkled faintly. Life continued, quiet, steady, unconcerned by the momentary tremor that had passed through the fortress. The young soldier leaned his head back against the palm trunk, its rough bark grounding him. His thoughts drifted next to his family, his mother's warm voice, his father's calm advice, the laughter of his little siblings echoing through the courtyard of their home. He remembered a moment from childhood, a sick goat lying weak on the ground. He had panicked, thinking it was dying. His father had knelt beside him and said, "Life is a trust, my son, a breath given and taken back. What matters is how gently we hold it." He hadn't understood then. He understood now. The idea sat heavily on his chest, but not painfully, more like a hand pressing lightly, reminding him to slow down, to notice the spaces between breaths. He watched a lantern flicker in a nearby window, its flame bending in the wind. For a moment, he imagined that flame as the lives they all carried, small, delicate, yet stubbornly warm against the darkness. As he breathed deeper, the heaviness began to shift. Not vanish, never that, but settle, like sand finding its place after a storm. He whispered a short dua under his breath, asking for steadiness, for clarity, for peace. And with each word, the tension loosened. He felt something else too, a soft, unexpected gratitude, not for danger, but for the gift of being reminded what mattered, for the chance to sit beneath a palm tree and breathe air that hadn't been his just moments before, for the simple, quiet privilege of watching the sky darken from blue to black. A soldier walked past on his way to evening prayer and gave him a small nod. The young man returned it with one of his own. Nothing needed to be said. Both understood the unspoken shared experience of a day that had brushed too close to something fragile. He stood slowly, brushing sand from his clothes. His limbs felt lighter now, his steps less burdened. The night was settling deep, and the fortress glowed with pockets of amber light. Somewhere nearby, laughter floated through the air, gentle, tired, the kind that surfaces only after tension has drained away. Life continued, and so did he. As he walked toward the prayer hall for Isha, he found himself noticing things he had ignored earlier. The silhouettes of birds roosting on the wall, the faint pattern of stars emerging above the watchtower, the way lanterns cast halos of gold onto the stone paths. Everything seemed touched with meaning simply because it existed. He offered his prayer quietly, letting the rhythm of standing and bowing soothe whatever remained unsettled within him. When he stepped back outside, the courtyard was washed in moonlight. A few soldiers lingered nearby, discussing plans for the next day. Someone mentioned leave being granted soon. Someone else spoke about spices they hoped to buy in the city. Small talk, gentle talk, talk about life, not danger. And it struck him, despite how close they lived to the edge of conflict, these moments were what filled most of their days. Ordinary exchanges, shared meals, the comfort of routine. The weight he had felt earlier softened into a kind of clarity. Life was fragile, yes, but precisely because of that, it was precious. He walked toward the gate, drawn by the hum of the evening town beyond the fortress. Voices drifted from the marketplace, a merchant closing his stall, a mother calling a child home, someone bargaining over spices, even this late. The world carried on, textured and colorful, untouched by the brief skirmish that had shaken the fortress earlier. He stood there for a moment, listening, letting the sounds wash over him like a balm. The heaviness that had filled his chest now felt like a quiet, steady presence, a companion rather than a burden, a reminder to live gently, a reminder to walk with awareness, a reminder of breath. And in that softened space within him, the night lifted its veil a little more, revealing a path forward, one filled not only with duty and discipline, but with simple joys waiting to be rediscovered. With a calmer heart and a clearer mind, he stepped away from the gate, ready to embrace the lighter rhythms that awaited him in the coming days. The weight of mortality had settled, yes, but it had made room for life's sweetness to rise. And so, carried by this newfound balance, he began to drift naturally toward the brighter air and bustling color of chapter 16. The city felt like a world unto itself that morning, as if its walls held not just people and houses, but entire continents of scent and sound. He entered the marketplace just after the first call to prayer echoed off the rooftops, and already the place was swelling with movement. Merchants unrolled carpets in long, rippling sheets of dyed wool. Women from the outskirts wandered in with baskets balanced on their hips. Children darted between stalls with the confident agility of cats. Everywhere he looked, color, deep cinnamons, blues that reminded him of pre-dawn shadows, splashes of bright saffron, poured out like a tapestry slowly unfolding. For weeks, the fortress had been his whole world, its rhythms strict and narrow. Training fields, patrol routes, barracks, prayer hall. But here the air itself seemed to breathe differently. Spices burned lightly in clay bowls, sending thin tendrils upward, and each one carried a memory or a question. Where it came from, who carried it across deserts, who bought it, who cooked with it, and who sat beside that food to share it. He moved slowly through the crowd, not wanting to miss anything. A man selling dried mint called out to him, insisting his blend was strong enough to wake a man from grief. Another held up a loop of prayer beads made from olive pits polished so smooth they reflected little circles of sun. There were scribes seated cross-legged behind their wooden boards, ready to write letters for those who could not write, and storytellers warming their voices for the afternoon performances. It felt like 1,000 doors opening, each one leading somewhere he did not have time to go. But he allowed himself, for the first time in many days, to wander without a destination. He watched a potter shape a jar with hands steady as still water. He paused beside a copper worker hammering bowls in a rhythm that felt almost musical, each strike sending a bright ringing into the bustle. He tasted a sliver of honey-soaked fig offered by an elderly vendor who refused to take a single coin from one of the young protectors of the frontier. He laughed at that title. It felt far too big for him, but it warmed him too. As he walked, he kept thinking of home. His mother's hands folding dough, his little brother chasing goats toward the shade, the old palm tree near their well that creaked softly in the wind. He wondered how long it would be before his letter reached them, whether they'd worry, whether they'd sit together after evening prayer, and imagine him standing exactly as he stood now, surrounded by noise and color. The gifts he chose were simple things, but chosen carefully. A small pouch of saffron for his mother, who always saved her best cooking for days when life felt especially heavy. A wooden whistle for his brother, carved in the shape of a bird with its wings folded. A length of fabric the color of cool river stones for his father, who preferred plain cloth but appreciated anything thoughtfully brought. When the sun climbed higher and shadows began to shorten, he stepped away from the densest part of the market and found a food seller heating bread on an overturned metal plate. The smell alone was enough to make him realize he was hungry. He bought a piece, tearing it slowly as he walked, letting crumbs fall like a trail he didn't mind losing. By midday, he had left the busiest alleys behind, yet the city still murmured around him, as if reluctant to let him go. Ahead lay the quieter roads, ones that wound through scattered gardens and clusters of mud brick houses. Beyond those, the open land stretched toward the neighboring village where he had been asked to deliver a message and check on a trade agreement. It wasn't an assignment of great danger, but it required care and a calm presence. And as he adjusted the strap of his satchel and turned toward that long, sunlit path, he felt the market's energy settle into him like a warm ember. The liveliness of the morning gave way to the steady peace of travel, and with each step he took, the atmosphere shifted naturally toward the journey waiting beyond the city walls, chapter 17 rising on the horizon like a gentle promise. The drought had crept in like a long shadow. First, the wells began to taste different, more metallic, the villagers said. Then the ground hardened, resisting the tools meant to coax life from it. By the time word reached the fortress, one well had collapsed entirely, and another was barely yielding enough to fill a handful of jars each day. So the garrison gathered who they could spare. This was still part of frontier duty, to protect, to support, to serve. Jihad here meant mending, not fighting. They rode in silence at first, the morning sun climbing slowly behind them. Sand stretched out in long, calm waves, broken only by clusters of hardy shrubs and the occasional bird circling in the heat. The protagonist walked beside one of the riders when the terrain grew too uneven for easy footing, using the quiet to think. Service, mercy, patience. He had heard these words in lessons from the scholars who visited, but it was here, on this slow journey toward people waiting with empty buckets, that their meaning seemed to sink deeper. By noon, the village appeared on the horizon, small, sun-bleached, almost fragile against the endless desert. A handful of mud brick homes clustered around a central square where a tired palm tree cast a thin circle of shade. Children were the first to notice the arriving team. They ran toward the visitors, not with shouts of excitement, but with a cautious, hopeful quiet, as if afraid that too much eagerness might scare the help away like startled birds. The village elder, a wiry man with a face lined like dried riverbeds, greeted them at the entrance. His voice cracked when he spoke, though whether from emotion or thirst was hard to tell. "You came," he said simply, as if uncertain whether anyone would answer their plea. The protagonist felt something stir inside him, a sense of responsibility that settled like a gentle weight across his shoulders. The work began immediately. The medic examined those weakened by dehydration, handing out measured portions of the garrison's reserve water, while urging everyone to drink slowly. The water engineer crawled into the damaged well's mouth, his voice muffled as he called for ropes, tools, and wooden supports. Others distributed sacks of grain, dates, and dried meat. The protagonist helped wherever hands were needed, carrying stones, clearing debris, lifting beams, organizing supplies. Sweat trickled down his forehead, drying almost as quickly as it formed in the relentless sun. Despite the fatigue, the work carried a kind of calm, no urgency of arrows or alarms, no clash of steel, only the steady rhythm of solving, fixing, relieving. This, too, was frontier life, though few outside the garrison ever spoke about it. When the first bucket of clean water rose from the repaired well, the entire village seemed to exhale at once. A woman covered her mouth with trembling hands. A boy wept without sound. The elder whispered a prayer that broke halfway through, too full of relief for its words to carry cleanly. As the heat softened into late afternoon, the villagers began preparing a meal, not out of surplus, for they had little to spare, but out of gratitude so sincere it felt as though the land itself softened beneath it. They insisted the team stay. Rugs were laid out beneath the old palm. Simple dishes were brought. Thin bread, lentils, a little honey someone had hidden away for emergencies. The air warmed with conversation, gentle, thankful, almost soothing. The protagonist sat among them, tired but deeply at peace. He watched the villagers' faces in the flickering firelight, listened to their stories of hard weeks and quiet hopes, and felt something inside him shift, another kind of strength settling into his bones, one built not on endurance or courage alone, but on compassion. And as the meal ended and night spread softly over the village, a new chapter began to rise in the distance, one shaped not by hardship alone, but by the hospitality they were about to receive in return, guiding him naturally into chapter 18. The meal was simple, but it carried the weight and warmth of gratitude that no feast could match. The villagers arranged woven mats beneath the old palm tree, its fronds whispering overhead as the desert breeze slipped through them. Clay dishes were placed carefully before the soldiers. Lentils cooked down with herbs. Thin bread baked fresh on a flat stone. A small bowl of dates that the elder insisted be shared evenly. A jug of water, precious beyond measure, was poured with ceremonial patience. The protagonist sat cross-legged near the center of the gathering, watching, as everyone settled into place. He could feel the humility of the moment. These people had lost so much to the drought, and yet here they were, offering what little remained with open hearts. It struck him deeply, not as a gesture of hospitality alone, but as a lesson, a lived reminder of the values he had been taught in the fortress classrooms and carried in his prayers. Conversation began slowly, like a cautious stream testing its new course. The villagers asked questions about the fortress, the routines of its soldiers, the long cycles of training. Children leaned closer, fascinated by the idea of night watches and distant horizons. The protagonist answered as simply as he could, careful not to romanticize anything. Much of it, he told them gently, is quiet work, patience, waiting, praying, watching the land as it sleeps. In return, he listened to their stories, stories that reminded him how vast the early empire truly was. One family had migrated from a coastal region where the air tasted of salt and the evenings were filled with the calls of seabirds. Another had come from a place of rolling hills where the harvest festivals lasted for days. An elderly woman spoke of her childhood in a northern climate, where snow fell in thick, silent blankets, and people heated their homes with brick ovens fueled by fragrant wood. He realized, with a kind of wonder, that although they were all part of the same world, their lives carried different textures, different rhythms. Their greetings, their foods, their songs, each held its own distinct shade of identity while still fitting into a larger tapestry. This, too, was the frontier. Not only soldiers and skirmishes, but a crossroads of cultures, paths woven together by shared faith and fragile roads. As trays were cleared away, the fire in the center of the gathering was fed with new pieces of wood, orange embers crackling to life. The warmth was gentle, not overbearing, and the shadows cast by the flames danced across the villagers' faces, softening their expressions into peaceful silhouettes. The protagonist leaned back on his hands, letting his body relax after the long day of labor. The tension he hadn't noticed earlier now unwound slowly from his shoulders. After more stories, laughter, and quiet silences, the kind that feel like a blessing rather than an awkward pause, the night grew cooler and the crowd began to disperse. Families collected their children. The elder patted the protagonist's shoulder with a gratitude too sincere for words. The soldiers were offered a guest house at the edge of the village, a modest structure with woven mats and a single lantern glowing like a small sun in the corner. But before heading inside, the protagonist lingered outside, drawn toward the open sky. The stars were brilliant, so clear, so sharp, against the blackness that they looked almost close enough to touch. He lay on his back in the sand, arms folded under his head, and let the firm earth cradle him. The constellations shifted slowly overhead, their ancient patterns whispering reminders of how small worries could seem beneath such vastness. He breathed deeply, letting the cool night air fill him. The weight of responsibility, the fatigue of the journey, the ache of memories and longing, they all softened under the starlight. He felt recentered, pulled gently back to the core of himself. The doubts that had followed him from the fortress quieted. In their place rose a clarity, calm and unhurried. Somewhere in those moments, between wakefulness and drifting rest. He felt the subtle tug of the road calling again, not urgently, not with pressure, but with the slow certainty that more awaited him. The next day would bring new instructions, new movements, new landscapes. And as his eyes finally closed beneath the glittering sky, the story eased naturally toward the next horizon, guiding him softly into chapter 19. He left the fortress at first light, the sky still holding the remnants of night like a faint veil. His horse moved with slow confidence, hooves pressing soft patterns into the sand. The road stretched empty before him, quiet and forgiving, giving him space to breathe in ways that even the peaceful village couldn't. This ride was different. It carried a strange mix of anticipation and softness, like stepping into a memory while still being pulled forward by time. The landscape shifted as he rode, wide plains giving way to gentle rises, scattered palms gathering around hidden springs, distant hills framing the edges of the world. The smells changed too, from dry stone and hot sand to the slightly sweeter scent of date groves and green shoots he remembered from childhood. Every familiar detail tugged lightly at his heart. With each mile, he felt chapters of his life folding back open. He remembered running these paths as a boy, barefoot and reckless. He remembered carrying firewood with his siblings, splashing in irrigation channels, sitting by the village imam as he recited Qur'an with the slow patience of a man who had taught 3 generations. He remembered his mother's hands, warm, busy, always finding a way to smooth his hair, even when he pretended he was too old for such things. The wind shifted, bringing with it a scent he had almost forgotten. Home cooking, drifting on morning air. His chest tightened with longing so sudden and tender that he had to slow his horse just to steady himself. He had grown much since leaving, toughened, disciplined, stretched by duty. But in the quiet cradle of approaching home, he felt young again, not lost, but softened. By midday, he reached the outer fields of his hometown. Farmers lifted their heads from their work, shading their eyes to see who traveled the dusty path. A few recognized him, even from a distance, and raised their hands in greeting. One old neighbor hurried forward, disbelief lighting his face. "Is it really you?" he asked, gripping the young soldier's shoulders. "Your mother will faint from joy." The protagonist smiled, a real one, unburdened, unguarded. He continued on foot from there, walking slowly so the moment could unfold naturally, savoring the nearness of each familiar sound. The bleating of goats, the chatter of women at the well, the rustle of palm fronds above the irrigation canals. And then he saw her. His mother stood outside their home, a bowl of lentils in her hands, her headscarf fluttering lightly in the breeze. She didn't notice him at first, but when she looked up, really looked, her breath caught. The bowl slipped from her hands and rolled harmlessly into the dust. "My son," she whispered, the words nearly breaking under their own weight. He crossed the distance in 3 long strides, her arms wrapped around him with a force that surprised even him, as though she were trying to make up for all the days she had spent worrying, praying, imagining worst-case scenarios. He held her tightly, feeling the familiar shape of her embrace, the heartbeat he had rested against as a child. Inside, the house smelled the same: warm bread, cumin, old wood, and the faint sweetness of dates stored in woven baskets. His siblings crowded him, half shy and half excited, peppering him with questions. His mother kept touching his face, his shoulders, his hair, checking that he was truly there. The meal she prepared was humble but abundant, her way of pouring love into every dish. As they ate, he told stories carefully chosen, enough to satisfy their curiosity, but gentle enough not to worry them. They laughed together, reminisced, and for a while, time felt like a friend instead of a force pulling him onward. That night, when the home finally quieted and only lamplight remained, he sat awake thinking of what waited beyond this brief visit. The frontier, the rhythms he had learned, the duties he had not yet completed, the path that had shaped him and was not yet finished shaping him. And as sleep drifted in softly, carrying him between who he had been and who he was becoming, the tenderness of the day guided him naturally toward the next horizon, easing the story into chapter 20. He woke before the first call to prayer, instinct drawing him from sleep, the way it always did at the fortress. The quiet inside the house felt different from the quiet of the ribat, softer, warmer, but also less urgent. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the familiar creak of the wooden beams overhead, the light breathing of his younger siblings curled nearby, and the distant sound of a rooster greeting the fading stars. When he rose, he moved carefully, not wanting to wake anyone. Outside, the cool air embraced him, like a memory that had been patiently waiting. He made his way to the small masjid at the edge of the village. The imam, an elderly man, with a voice that had guided half the village through childhood recitation, paused in surprise when he saw him enter. "You have returned," the imam said, smiling through a white beard, "and earlier than even the farmers." The protagonist smiled back. "Old habits, teacher." They prayed side by side, the young soldier feeling a strange mixture of familiarity and distance in the motions. The masjid was the same, the clay walls, the simple reed mats, the faint scent of old books. But he felt taller inside it now, not in pride, but in perspective. The world had stretched around him since he'd last stood beneath this ceiling gawang. After prayer, a few neighbors approached to greet him. They commented on how strong he looked, how mature, how calm. One of the older men nodded approvingly. "The frontier teaches boys to become men," he said. But the protagonist found himself unsure how to respond. The frontier had not made him harder. It had made him quieter, more aware, more responsible. The change people saw on the surface was only a small reflection of what had shifted inside. Back at home, his mother was already awake, preparing breakfast with movements that seemed faster now. As he greeted her, she cupped his face in both hands, searching him with eyes that were tender but perceptive. "You're here," she said softly, "but you're also somewhere else." He opened his mouth to reassure her, but found no simple words. Instead, he sat beside her and began helping shape the dough. His hands moved differently now, more practiced in tying saddle straps and gripping reins than household tasks, but she watched with a smile that needed no explanation. The morning passed in small moments. Laughter with his siblings when they asked him to show them how soldiers trained, silence with his mother as they sorted dates together, a long walk through the groves with his uncle, who insisted on hearing every detail of frontier life. Yet throughout all of it, he felt the steady awareness that he no longer fit into the rhythms of home the way he once had. He loved it deeply, but he moved inside it like a guest rather than a resident. In the afternoon, he visited the small canal where he had played as a child. The water shimmered in the sunlight, and children splashed just as he had years ago. One of them asked him if the frontier was dangerous. "Sometimes," he said, after a thoughtful pause. "But danger is not the whole story. There is work, there is prayer, there is patience. Most days are quiet." The boy looked unconvinced, imagining battles because stories often simplified what reality refused to. The protagonist almost smiled because he once had imagined the same. As sunset approached, he sat with his mother again. She asked the question she had been holding since the day he arrived. "When do you return?" "Soon," he answered gently. Her eyes lowered, absorbing the truth she had always known was coming. But after a moment, she nodded. "You left as my son," she whispered. "You return as something more. I can see it, and I am proud, even if it hurts." He took her hand, squeezing it with the steadiness learned through long nights on watchtowers and long journeys across open plains. "You raised me for this," he said quietly. That night, as lamps burned low and the sky deepened into a soft dusk, he felt both the ache of leaving and the certainty of duty settling into place. Home had embraced him fully, but it also reminded him that he could no longer remain within its walls for long. And with that quiet acknowledgement, the first light of parting began to form, guiding the story gently toward chapter 21. The night before his departure passed with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. His mother had prepared a simple meal, and though everyone tried to speak lightly, laughter kept dissolving into quiet moments heavy with unspoken thoughts. When the lamps were extinguished and the family retreated to their bedding, he found sleep slow to arrive. He lay awake listening to the soft breathing around him, memorizing the sound the way a traveler memorizes the shape of a familiar landmark before setting out once more. It wasn't sorrow that kept him awake, just a deep, tender awareness that this chapter of closeness was coming to its natural end. Before dawn, when the horizon was only a pale smear of blue-gray, he rose quietly and stepped outside into air cool enough to sting his lungs. The village was still asleep, except for a few early risers preparing for their own tasks. He stood there a moment, looking at the sky that had watched over every stage of his life, from boyhood mischief to the responsibilities he now carried. There was no resistance in him, no conflict, only a steady acceptance that felt like exhaling after holding one's breath for too long. Chapter 21, Farewell at Dawn, 666 words. He returned inside and gently woke his mother. She sat up slowly, blinking away sleep, and then, as though remembering everything all at once, simply held him. It was a long embrace, longer than their first greeting, softer, but filled with something deeper. Not grief, not fear, something closer to surrender. When she finally released him, she brushed his cheek the way she had done when he was a child leaving for the masjid at dawn. "Allah protect you," she whispered, "and return you better than when you left." His siblings stirred next, 2 younger sisters and a brother barely into his teens. They rose groggily, but when they realized what was happening, Their faces fell into matching expressions of reluctant understanding. The littlest girl rubbed her eyes and clung to his robe. "Will you come back again?" she asked. "Of course," he replied, kneeling to her height. "And when I do, you'll have so many stories to tell me that I won't be able to keep up." She tried to smile, but it wavered. They walked together toward the village outskirts, where the caravan would gather. The sky was brightening, but still quiet, a soft pre-dawn glow washing over the palm groves. The call to prayer had not yet begun, and the silence carried a sacred weight. It felt as if the entire world was holding its breath for this moment. A few neighbors were already present. They greeted him with gentle nods, offering brief blessings and steady gazes. Farewells were not dramatic here. They were woven with faith, with the understanding that those who served on the frontier did so not for glory, but for protection, stability, and devotion. His horse stood ready, saddled and calm. He stroked its neck, taking comfort in the familiar feel of warm hide beneath his palm. When he finally turned to his family, there was no rush, no panic, just the quiet unfolding of a moment everyone had prepared their hearts for. His mother stepped forward last. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heartbeat. "Your place is with Allah first," she said softly. "Then with the Ummah, then with us. Go where you are needed." He bowed his head, feeling the words settle inside him, like stones laid carefully into a foundation. As the caravan began assembling, soldiers returning from leave, merchants heading toward the frontier city, travelers seeking protection along the roads, his siblings moved closer, reluctant to let the moment slip too quickly. He bent to them one more time. "Take care of Mother," he said, tapping his younger brother lightly on the shoulder. "And don't let the goats wander into the date fields again." His brother shook his head, embarrassed but smiling. "We won't," he promised. "And when you come back, I'll be taller than you." "We'll see," the young soldier laughed. The caravan leader called out a soft announcement. It was time. He mounted his horse. His mother stepped back, lifting her hand in blessing. His siblings did the same in smaller, hesitant motions. A few breaths of stillness passed between them, all held within the delicate cocoon of the dawn. Then the caravan began to move. Hooves pressed into the sand. Wheels creaked. The group advanced slowly, giving families time to walk alongside for several paces. His siblings trotted at his side, trying to stay with him as long as possible. Eventually, the path narrowed, and they had to stop. He looked back again and again, until distance softened their shapes into silhouettes. The rising sun framed them gently, turning the moment into something that would remain etched in his memory forever. As the village finally disappeared behind the curve of the dunes, the familiar pull of duty reclaimed his thoughts. The frontier was waiting. His comrades were waiting. A new phase of service awaited him. And with each mile of the journey, the path led him steadily toward the responsibilities of Chapter 22. The ride back to the fortress felt different this time, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. The dust rising from the hooves didn't cling to him as stubbornly as before, and the horizon no longer seemed endless. He had left his home again, yes, but he carried it now in a steadier place inside him. His mother's parting prayers still echoed gently in his chest, and his siblings' sleepy waves at dawn lingered like warm fingerprints on his memory. By the time the fortress walls appeared through the wavering heat, he felt as though he were returning, not as the uncertain youth who had first arrived months ago, but as someone who had earned a quiet space among the men who stood watch over this remote edge of the empire. What he didn't expect was the commotion waiting for him. The courtyard was alive with movement, clattering boots, excited voices, fresh bundles being unloaded from wagons. A whole group of new recruits had arrived 2 days earlier, the commander informed him, and none of them had ever lived beyond their towns. Wide eyes, stiff backs, careful steps. He recognized the signs instantly. They were him, only a season earlier. The commander placed a firm hand on his shoulder, a gesture both casual and deliberate. "You'll help them settle," he said simply. No ceremony, no lengthy instruction. Yet the weight of the trust in those few words pressed deeper than any assignment before it. The protagonist nodded, feeling the quiet shift of responsibility settle into his bones. The recruits stood gathered near the stables, clutching their packs like shields. Some were barely older than boys. Others carried themselves with a bravado that was already beginning to crack under the dusty sun. When he approached, their gazes snapped toward him, searching. Some for reassurance, some for direction, some just for someone who seemed to know what to do next. He greeted them one by one, using their names, offering small smiles, steadying the nervous energy in the air. He showed them where to store their belongings, where they would sleep, where to collect water. Simple things, the same things someone had once shown him, but now he delivered them with an ease that surprised even himself. The fortress no longer felt foreign. Its corners, sounds, and routines were familiar enough to offer to others like a kind of shelter. Later, during their first training session, he observed them with a mixture of patience and empathy. The drills were nothing complicated. Basic footing, basic strikes, basic formations. But their legs wobbled, their arms tired too quickly, and their lines bent like soft reeds in the wind. He corrected their postures gently, explaining, demonstrating, adjusting their grips. Even the boldest among them softened under his calm approach. His voice wasn't loud, yet they listened, they trusted him. And he realized he didn't need to be forceful to be respected. One recruit, a thin young man from a distant coastal village, messed up the same step repeatedly, stumbling over his own feet. Frustration reddened his face. The protagonist gestured for him to take a breath and repeated the movement slowly beside him. The boy matched him, breath for breath, step for step, and this time landed firmly. Relief washed over him like cool water. "You'll get there," the protagonist said, clapping his shoulder. "We all start somewhere." As evening settled, the recruits gathered around him with questions, not just about drills, but about life in the fortress, about the desert winds, about the prayers at dawn, even about the best way to keep sand out of one's bedding. He answered every question with the steady warmth of someone who remembered what it felt like to be overwhelmed by so much newness. When night finally draped itself over the outpost, he lay awake for a moment, listening to the soft murmurs of the newcomers settling into their palates. He felt responsible for them, not just for their training, but for their safety, their growth, their sense of belonging. It was a new kind of weight, but not a burdensome one. It was the kind of weight that shaped a man rather than bent him. In that quiet, he sensed the next step forming naturally ahead of him. Leadership, not imposed, but grown. These recruits, with their nervous laughter and awkward stances, would soon look to him for more than instructions. And as he drifted toward sleep, he embraced the path beginning to unfold, one that would carry him gracefully into chapter 23. The first patrol he led came without announcement, without a sudden rise in rank, without any moment that felt like ceremony. It happened in the same quiet way that dawn over the desert always arrived, soft, gradual, unpretending. The commander simply handed him the slate that listed the day's assignments and said, "You'll take Squad 3. No explanation, no fanfare, just a nod, then the turning of a page as though this had always been the next natural step. He looked at the names on the slate, 3 new recruits and 1 seasoned soldier who had watched him grow from uncertain novice to steady hand. The seasoned one gave him a small, knowing smile. That smile alone, light as it was, told him he was ready. When he gathered the squad and briefed them on their patrol route, a simple sweep around the low hills east of the fortress, they listened with an attentiveness he hadn't quite expected. Their shoulders angled subtly toward him. Their eyes held that quiet waiting that soldiers have when they want reassurance cloaked beneath routine instruction. And he gave it to them, not by force, but by speaking steadily, clearly, with the calm he himself once borrowed from others. As they set off, the sunrise stretched long strands of gold across the sand. The morning air held the coolness that never lasted long, and the desert shrubs whispered faintly as they walked through the sparse brush. He kept their pace balanced, steady, but not rushed. When one of the recruits lagged behind, adjusting his pack, he slowed the entire group without making it a point of embarrassment. When another looked nervously at the distant rocky outcrop, rumored to be a bandit observation point, he moved beside him, speaking of harmless things until the tension eased from the young man's shoulders. Leadership, he realized, was not in the shape of his voice or the firmness of his commands. It was in the small things, the way he checked the water skins without making it feel like surveillance, the way he scanned the horizon with measured breaths instead of anxious ones, the way he kept conversation gentle so the recruits didn't stew in their own nerves. Calm was contagious, and they caught it from him. Halfway through the patrol, they paused near a cluster of low stones where desert lizards darted in and out of the sun patches. The recruits sat gratefully, drinking water, adjusting straps, stretching out their legs. He used that moment not to lecture, but to observe how they handled their equipment, how quickly they recovered breath, how they interacted with each other. The seasoned soldier sat beside him, offering a quiet comment now and then, but mostly watching him rather than the recruits. The unspoken assessment was there, but it didn't unsettle him. He knew he was steady. When they continued walking, a sudden gust of wind swept a swirl of dust into the air. One recruit flinched. Another shielded his face with an unnecessary urgency. Instead of chiding them, he explained the patterns of the desert wind, how these short dust flicks signaled nothing but a minor shift in air currents, not a coming storm. His voice was light, conversational. Soon the recruits were talking again, their earlier tension dissolving like mist under the sun. By the end of the patrol, their steps had fallen into natural rhythm. Their lines straightened without correction. Their breaths evened out. They trusted the terrain more, and perhaps more importantly, they trusted him. When the fortress walls appeared again in the distance, the recruits walked with a touch of pride in their gait. The seasoned soldier gave him another quiet look, this one deeper, almost approving in a way only veterans could make meaningful without words. Back inside the fortress, he submitted the report to the commander. Nothing remarkable to note, just a routine patrol completed smoothly. The commander skimmed it, then lifted his eyes with a hint of satisfaction. "Good," he said simply. "You'll take them out again tomorrow." He walked out of the office breathing more deeply than usual, not from fatigue, but from the dawning realization that something had shifted. Leadership hadn't arrived with a loud step. It had crept in, gentle as morning light, natural as breath. He didn't feel burdened or overwhelmed. Instead, he felt aligned, as though his earlier experiences, fear, learning, firelight stories, letters home, moments of reflection, had all led him precisely here. And as the sun dipped lower and the courtyard hummed with evening activity, he sensed the path ahead growing broader. His confidence now had shape, depth, and direction, setting the foundation for the next chapter of his journey, chapter 24, where new challenges would test this quiet leadership even further. The sky gave the first warning, long before the rain itself arrived. As he led his small squad out for their routine afternoon patrol, he noticed the strange stillness that settled over the desert, the kind that makes sound feel cushioned, as though the world inhales and holds its breath. The wind shifted, no longer the dry, familiar breeze of the frontier, but a heavier, cooler current rolling down from distant hills. Above them, clouds gathered in thick, dark folds. He slowed the patrol subtly, not wanting to alarm the new recruits, but the seasoned soldier shot him a small, confirming glance. "Storm?" the older man murmured under his breath. He nodded. "A strong one." Still, they continued for a while longer, scanning the terrain as required, checking the rocky crevices and dune edges for any sign of movement. But the shadows deepened too quickly, and an uneasy hum threaded the air. When the first drop hit his cheek, cold and sharp as a pebble, he halted the squad. "We head back," he said calmly. "Stay close. Don't let the wind break our line." They turned toward the fortress, but the desert had other plans. The rain came suddenly, as if a great skin of water above them had split open. Sheets of it slammed down in wild diagonal strokes. The wind howled, lashing sand and water against their faces. Within seconds, visibility shrank to almost nothing. He raised his voice just enough to be heard. "Hands on the shoulder in front of you. Do not separate." A recruit fumbled for the person ahead, panic flickering in his eyes. The leader took his hand, placed it firmly against the next soldier's shoulder, and gave a reassuring squeeze. The line formed, unstable at first, then steady. But even with that, progress was nearly impossible. The ground beneath them had turned to slippery mud, sucking at their boots. The rain pounded so hard it stung, and the storm showed no sign of weakening. Turning back to the fortress was now too risky. They could drift off course, get lost in the darkened wasteland, or walk unknowingly toward a cliff or pit. He scanned the storm-blurred horizon, searching for anything that could offer shelter. And then he saw it, the faint silhouette of a ruined watchtower, half collapsed, but still standing, about 100 paces to their right. With firm gestures and raised voice, he guided the squad toward it. They moved slowly, leaning against the force of the wind, each step uncertain but determined. The desert swallowed sound, swallowed shape, swallowed direction, but their chain held. At last, they reached the tower's shadow. He pushed aside a broken wooden plank, ushering the others through the narrow gap. Inside, the air was still damp and cold, but the walls blocked the worst of the wind. The rain hammered the roof overhead, sounding like stones thrown from the sky. The recruits collapsed against the walls, shivering, breathless, faces pale with adrenaline. He did not let himself rest yet. Instead, he checked each of them, hands, faces, eyes, making sure no one was badly scraped or disoriented. The seasoned soldier helped, his presence grounding the moment. Only when everyone was safe did the leader sink down near the center of the room. The recruits looked at him in a way that was different now, not just with respect, but with trust, born of being protected in a moment where the desert could have easily swallowed them. To warm themselves, they huddled closer together. Someone produced flint from their pack, and with careful effort they coaxed a small fire to life, its glow trembling against the cracked stone walls. Steam rose from their soaked cloaks. Their breath came out in white puffs. Yet despite the harshness of the storm outside, a strange peace filled the ruined tower. One of the recruits began reciting a short prayer, quiet, uncertain. The others joined, voices soft, blending with the roar of the rain. The sound was steadying, anchoring them in the dark. The leader closed his eyes briefly, letting the warmth of the fire touch his chilled skin, letting the murmured supplications remind him of why they were here, why any of them stayed on this frontier. Not for glory or adventure, but for something deeper, steadier, protection, service, patience, brotherhood. Hours passed before the storm began to ease. The thunder softened, the rain thinned to a whisper, and eventually light seeped faintly into the cracks of the tower wall. Morning. The world smelled different, cleansed, renewed. When they stepped out, the desert glowed under a pearly sky. Puddles shone like scattered mirrors. The sand, flattened by the rain, bore ripples like the surface of a calm lake. He breathed in slowly. The squad behind him did the same. "Back to the fortress," he said gently. Slowly, the ground still soft. They walked with renewed unity, the storm having stitched them together in ways no training yard ever could. And as the sun rose brighter, warming their shoulders, the path opened naturally toward the next part of his journey, chapter 25, where the frontier would challenge him yet again, though in ways he couldn't yet foresee. The storm had washed the world clean, and as they walked back toward the fortress, the first colors of dawn unfurled across the horizon with a gentleness that felt almost unreal. It began as a pale, silvery glow above the farthest dunes, soft enough that at first he thought his eyes were still adjusting after the long night. But then the light deepened, warming from pearl to rose. from rose to a molten gold that touched the sand and made it shine like scattered grains of amber. He slowed his steps without consciously deciding to, and the squad behind him softened their pace too, as if the desert itself had asked them to be quiet. The wind that brushed across their faces was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth. Rare, soothing, a breath of life in a land usually so dry it crackled beneath the sun. The dunes, still dark at their bases, curled in smooth waves as far as the eye could see, their edges glowing brighter and brighter as the sun crept upward. For a moment, he forgot the fortress, the patrols, the weight of duty. He forgot the storm, even though its remnants glittered as tiny droplets on their cloaks. Everything narrowed into this single moment, this sunrise that felt like the desert opening its heart. He stepped up a small rise in the sand and stood still, letting the light wash over him. Behind him, the recruits also grew quiet, instinctively sensing that this was not a moment for chatter. The seasoned soldier folded his arms and watched the horizon with a faint smile, one that said he'd seen many sunrises but never grown tired of them. The sun broke fully then, a brilliant disk rising from the earth as though pushed up by invisible hands. Its rays stretched across the sky like golden fingers, reaching far beyond what any of them could see, touching distant mountains, far-off valleys, hidden oases. The world brightened by degrees, colors shifting softly, pink fading into gold, gold into pale blue, blue into a sprawling clarity. He murmured "Dicker" under his breath, the words flowing more easily than usual, as though drawn out by the desert itself. Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah. Each phrase felt like it rose with the sun, lifting the tension from his chest, smoothing out the last frayed edges left by the storm. His breath slowed, his shoulders loosened. He felt grounded, present, profoundly small, and profoundly held at the same time. The recruits, noticing his quiet recitation, joined with their own whispers, some confident, some hesitant. Their voices blended into the gentle morning wind. The earth seemed to listen. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth settle onto his face. It wasn't just a sunrise, it was a renewal, a reminder that hardships softened, that storms passed, that light always followed, even in the harshest lands, even after the darkest nights. When he opened his eyes again, the sun was higher, its glow stronger. The moisture in the air gave the light a misty shimmer, making the whole desert seem to breathe. The dunes appeared endless, yet each ridge felt familiar, as if the land itself were an old companion returning after a long journey. He knew without needing to be told that this moment would stay with him. No matter how many years he served on this frontier, no matter how many storms or patrols or long nights he endured, he would remember this sunrise, the one that arrived after the storm, when his squad stood together, not as scattered soldiers, but as a single, steady unit. The one that made him feel, for the first time, that the desert trusted him as much as he trusted it. "Come," he said quietly, his voice gentle, almost reverent. "Let's head back." But even as they resumed their walk, none of them hurried. Their footsteps were slow, deliberate, as though each step deserved to be taken with full attention. The desert, newly washed and glowing, hummed with a serenity he couldn't fully describe, but deeply felt. By the time the fortress rose into view, the sun was a warm coin in the sky, the air growing brighter with every passing minute. The recruits talked softly among themselves, sharing impressions of the storm and the sunrise, their voices calm and thoughtful. When they reached the gate, the seasoned soldier leaned slightly toward him and said, "Not every patrol gives a man a memory worth keeping. This one will stay with them, and with you." He nodded, wordless but grateful. The sunrise still glowed inside him, and as he crossed the threshold back into the fortress, he sensed that the peace of the moment had opened a new space within him, a space ready for deeper thoughts, deeper questions, the kind that could only be explored in honest conversation. That quiet readiness led him naturally toward what awaited in chapter 26, the philosophical discussions that would broaden his understanding of duty, life, and the meaning of the path he walked. The peace of the sunrise lingered with him long after they returned to the fortress. Even as he brushed the sand from his cloak, even as he washed his hands and arms at the well, he felt a soft clarity settle inside him, as though the desert had placed a calm hand on his heart. That calm stayed with him later that afternoon, when he made his way to the stables to tend the horses. The animals needed care after the stormy night, and he welcomed the quiet work. The stables were warm with the scent of hay and leather, filled with the low, steady sounds of horses shifting, breathing, stamping. Sunlight filtered through the slats and thin, golden lines that striped the dusty floor. As he entered, a familiar voice greeted him. "You survived the storm," said Harith, one of the first friends he had made at the Ribat, a thoughtful young man with a soft voice and eyes that always seemed to be studying something far away. "And the sunrise," he replied with a faint smile. "Both were reminders." Harith raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" He shrugged and reached for a brush. "I'm still figuring that out." Harith chuckled under his breath and joined him beside a tall brown mare, who leaned into the grooming with clear pleasure. For a while they worked in silence, the kind that felt comfortable, the kind shared by people who didn't need to fill every space with words. But after a few minutes, Harith spoke again, his tone gentle. "Do you believe the sunrise was written for us? Or did we simply happen to be there at the right time?" He paused mid-brush, considering the question. It was just like Harith to drift from small talk to the heart of a matter with barely a breath in between. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe both." Harith hummed thoughtfully. "I've always wondered about that balance between what's written and what we choose. Out here, it feels sharper somehow, like each step matters more." The protagonist nodded, moving around to the horse's other side. "My mother used to tell me that qadr isn't something meant to paralyze us. She said Allah sets the path, but we still have to walk it. Sometimes we run, sometimes we crawl, sometimes we stop and cry, but the path is always there." Harith smiled softly. "Your mother is a wise woman." "She is," he said, feeling a brief ache for home. For a moment, they brushed in silence again, the rhythmic strokes steady and soothing. The mare flicked her tail lazily, clearly content. Harith leaned slightly against the stall door. "So do you think we chose this life? The fortress, the training, the long nights?" He thought back, the messenger arriving in his village, the decision made with a trembling heart. the mixture of duty and fear and longing. The long roads, the first patrol, the sunrise that still glowed inside him. Yes, he said slowly, I chose it, but I also feel like I was led to it, like something in me was preparing even before I knew. Harith nodded, as though he had expected that answer. Sometimes, I think Allah guides us with feelings more than events. A restlessness, a pull, a moment of clarity. And then we look back one day and realize every small thing brought us here. The protagonist smiled, even the things we resisted. Especially those, Harith said, laughing quietly. They finished brushing the mare and moved on to another horse, a young stallion who snorted impatiently but settled under their hands. The work kept their bodies busy, but their minds drifted with ease. Harith, always more philosophical, spoke again. Do you ever wonder what your purpose actually is? Not in a grand sense, just in your own life? He nodded slowly. Every day, especially lately. And sometimes it feels like purpose is something simple, something quiet, like being steady for others, or doing what's right even when no one sees it. Harith let out a thoughtful breath. Yes, I think purpose is rarely loud. The protagonist looked up, brushing stray dust from his hands. And maybe it's not fixed. Maybe it changes as we change. Harith's eyes softened. That sounds true. Outside the stable, the wind rustled against the wooden beams, carrying the faint call of distant voices. A sense of peace settled between them, deep, reflective, shaped by the morning's sunrise and the long months of shared duty. They tended the last horse together, working slowly, savoring the quiet. When they finally stepped outside, the sky was a pale blue bowl overhead, and the sun's warmth pressed gently on their shoulders. Harith stretched his arms and sighed. These talks, they help me make sense of things. Me too, the protagonist said. And as they walked back toward the fortress gate, he realized that these quiet conversations, these moments of honesty shared among friends, were becoming just as important to him as the training, the missions, even the discipline of the ribat. They shaped him in ways he hadn't expected, opening doors inside his heart that he didn't realize were closed. He sensed, too, that something awaited him, something that would touch those new spaces within him. A message, a voice from home. And with that quiet intuition, the story drifted into chapter 27. For days after that quiet conversation in the stables, he carried a gentler rhythm inside him, like a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding finally released. Training felt easier, the prayers felt deeper, and even the long walks along the ramparts seemed to pass with a kind of softened clarity. And perhaps, because of that inner calm, he noticed the small things more. The scent of fresh bread carried from the kitchen courtyard, the way the sun warmed the clay walls in the late afternoon, the laughter of new recruits drifting across the training field. It was during one such afternoon, warm, still, touched by the fading gold of approaching evening, that he saw the courier caravan approaching the fortress gate. At first, he didn't think anything of it. Caravans came and went occasionally, delivering supplies, official notices, and sometimes letters. Most days, they held nothing for him, and he had grown used to watching others receive their parchment notes and tear them open with shaky hands. But something stirred in his chest as he watched this caravan, a feeling he couldn't name. Harith, standing beside him, noticed the slight tilt of his head. "Expecting something?" Harith asked. He hesitated. Maybe, or maybe I just hope. Harith smiled gently. Hope is its own kind of expectation. They made their way toward the courtyard where the courier had dismounted. Soldiers gathered around the small wooden chest strapped behind his saddle, waiting as he unlocked it and called out names one by one. Each time a name rang through the air, someone stepped forward with a mix of eagerness and fear. Letters were like small pieces of a world far away, sometimes comforting, sometimes painful, but always powerful. He stood quietly, hands clasped behind him, trying not to betray the fluttering inside his chest. From the village of, the courier began. His heart skipped. That was his home. For the soldier, the courier lifted a small roll of parchment tied neatly with a thin thread of woven palm fiber. The son of Amina. His breath caught. That was him. Harith nudged him with a grin. Go! He stepped forward, almost in disbelief, and accepted the letter. It was warm from the courier's travel bag, faintly scented with dust and the distant memory of home. For a moment, he simply held it, feeling the familiar texture of his village's parchment, thinner, softer than what the fortress used. The courtyard buzzed with life, but around him, everything felt quiet. He walked toward the shade of a wall, sat down on a worn step, and carefully untied the thread. The parchment unfurled like a breath. He recognized his mother's handwriting instantly. Steady, looping, humble. The first words blurred his vision before he finished reading them. My beloved son. He blinked hard, drawing in a slow breath, and continued. She wrote about the little things he had longed to know. The date harvest had been good this year. The neighbor's daughter had gotten married. His younger brother had grown tall enough to help their uncle in the fields. She described how the village well had finally been repaired, how the nights had become cooler, and how the masjid's imam had asked about him during every Friday prayer. And then came the lines that tightened his throat. We miss you, but we are proud of you. Every night I ask Allah to keep you safe. Your siblings send their salam, and your brother says he is trying to memorize the surah you told him about before you left. Come home when you can, my son. The door will always be open, and the lantern will always be lit. He pressed the parchment briefly to his forehead, letting the words settle into him like warm water soaking into dry earth. Emotion rose gently, not sharp or painful, but soft, grateful, almost overwhelming in its tenderness. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand before the tears could fall. Harith sat down beside him without speaking, simply leaning back against the same wall, as if offering silent company. After a moment, he asked quietly, Good news? He nodded, unable to form words. Harith smiled. Alhamdulillah, letters like that, they carry you for months. He looked back at the parchment, smoothing it carefully. It feels like she's here, like home reached across the desert. And it did, Harith said. The fortress seemed brighter, lighter. Even the air felt different, as if the wind that carried dust and heat had, just this once, carried blessings instead. Later, after Maghrib prayer, he read the letter again slowly, savoring each line. Some of the younger recruits saw him smiling to himself and whispered with curiosity, but he didn't mind. That small piece of home was now folded neatly and tucked into the inner pocket of his cloak, resting near his heart. He knew he would read it again many times in the nights to come. And with that gentle lift of spirit, with that newfound warmth in his chest, The rhythm of life at the ribat softened once more, carrying him calmly and steadily into the season that awaited him. A season not of battles or storms, but of quiet days, steady routines, and peaceful weeks. A season of calm. And so the story moved smoothly into chapter 28. The frontier quieted as though the desert itself were breathing slowly. Winds softened, carrying only fine sand instead of stinging grit. The sky stayed open and untroubled. For months, no alarms sounded from the outer towers. No sudden calls for reinforcement echoed through the courtyard. Life fell into a rhythm so steady that even the seasoned veterans found themselves walking a little lighter, speaking a little softer. For the protagonist, these calm months felt like being allowed to exhale for the first time in a long while. He woke each dawn to the muffled rustle of his bunkmates rising, the soft clearing of throats, the familiar creak of wooden beams above their heads. Before the sun even touched the edge of the dunes, he and the others lined up in the open courtyard for Fajr, the ground cool beneath their feet. The early air smelled faintly of dew, settling on stone, though the desert carried almost none. After prayer, they shared warm bread, olives, sometimes dates when supplies were generous. Conversations were unhurried, drifting from jokes to memories to plans for when their service ended. Training resumed its usual cadence, far less urgent than during times of unrest. The new recruits, once stiff, uncertain, jittery, had begun to settle into dependable rhythm. He watched them grow into their roles with a quiet pride, noticing how they held their shields more naturally now, how their horses trusted them more readily, how their fear receded by degrees. He corrected them gently, remembering exactly how patient his own seniors had been. Leadership had come to him quietly, and now it rested on him comfortably. When drills ended, the fortress hummed with simple industry. Some men cleaned weapons, others checked water stores, others maintained the stables or patched torn cloaks. The protagonist often joined the group, tending to the horses, brushing their coats, checking hooves, whispering soft praise to the nervous ones. The animals responded to him easily. Perhaps they sensed the calm fermenting inside him. Small missions still occurred, escorting caravans, delivering messages to nearby villages, inspecting the wells, but none carried the strain or risk of earlier months. Dusty roads felt safer. Travelers greeted the soldiers warmly. Villagers offered hospitality freely. Everywhere they went, the atmosphere seemed touched by ease. Worship deepened in that peace. At night, after the last patrol returned and the fortress quieted, the protagonist stayed awake to recite Qur'an by lamplight. The words landed differently when the world was still. He lingered upon verses about patience, gratitude, and the unseen wisdom behind every decree. Sometimes he sat atop the wall after Isha, watching stars spill across the sky like glittering grains. The silence around him was vast enough to hear his own heartbeat. He also wrote more letters home, longer and gentler than before. He told his mother about the new recruits who made him laugh, about the old cook who insisted everyone eat seconds, about the night a stray cat wandered into the barracks and decided to stay. He told her the desert was teaching him something he couldn't yet describe, but could feel in the way his breaths lengthened, in the way He had begun to crave quieter moments instead of louder ones. Her replies mirrored that tranquility. Stories of harvest, of rain finally touching their fields, of neighbors sending their salams, of prayers made for him at every dawn. As weeks turned into months, he felt a subtle shift inside himself. Not excitement, nor impatience, something steadier. A sense of completion drawing near. His term of service was almost finished. He had earned the right to return home. Yet he also felt a reluctant fondness for this fortress, this land, these people who had shaped him. The season of calm was a reminder that life on the frontier wasn't only hardship. It held beauty, community, purpose. One cool dusk, as he sat with his closest friend watching the lanterns flicker on across the courtyard, his friend nudged him lightly and said, "Your eyes look different these days, softer, like someone who knows where he's going next." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the sky deepen from blue to violet, waited until the first star appeared, and finally murmured, "Maybe. Or maybe the desert has just taught me how to be still." His friend smiled, as though that answer was enough. As night unfurled, a messenger arrived at the fortress gate, dusty, tired, carrying a sealed letter marked with the commander's insignia. The riders near the stables paused. The guards straightened. The quiet moment rippled. Something was changing. And just like that, the calm began to turn toward the next chapter. The sky above the fortress shifted into a deep blue, its last traces of daylight draining away behind the dunes. Lanterns flickered to life across the courtyard, their soft golden circles trembling on the sand-packed ground. He paused at the threshold of the barracks, listening. The familiar sounds, distant laughter from the mess hall, the thud of a bucket set down in the stables, the low hum of men sharing stories, wrapped around him like a worn cloak. He stepped forward slowly, not wanting to rush a single moment of this final night. His first stop was the well at the courtyard's center. He had hauled water from it countless times, during chaotic days after skirmishes, during blistering heat, during peaceful evenings where the only rush was to prepare tea. He laid his palm on the cool stone rim, remembering how often he'd leaned against it after long drills, breathless and young and unsure of himself. The well had been witness to every version of him that had come and gone. He whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, letting his fingertips linger before moving on. Near the armory, he passed 2 recruits polishing their shields. They looked up, surprised to see him walking without his usual brisk stride. "Heading out tomorrow?" one asked. He nodded. "Fajr." They exchanged respectful smiles, the shy, earnest kind only new soldiers give to someone they quietly admire. He gave them a gentle reminder to trust their commander and stay patient in their training. They laughed awkwardly, promised they would, and he left them to their work, warmed by their sincerity. Beyond them lay the practice grounds. The sand there carried the imprint of hundreds of drills, a history written in footprints and scuff marks. He walked onto it slowly, remembering the times he had stumbled through formations, sword too heavy, shield too stiff. He remembered the older soldiers guiding him, steadying him, teaching him to breathe through fear and fatigue. Now, he was the one who had taught others. The realization settled in his chest, quiet, profound. He knelt briefly, letting his hand sift through the sand as though it were something sacred. When he rose again, he turned toward the stables. The warm smell of hay and oil drifted out before he even reached the entrance. Inside, the horses shifted and snorted softly. His own mare lifted her head as he approached, ears flicking forward in recognition. She had carried him through storms, through long missions, through nights darker than memory. He pressed his forehead to hers, whispering gratitude into the space between them. She nudged his shoulder gently, as if understanding. He stayed with her longer than he planned. When he left the stables, the fortress was fully under the rule of night. Stars shimmered overhead, sharp, bright, countless. He made his way toward the outer wall, climbing the familiar stone steps until he stood where he had stood so many times before. From there, he could see the endless dunes stretching away into the quiet dark, their shapes softened by moonlight. The wind carried nothing but cool air and whispered sand. This was the place where he had learned stillness. He leaned on the wall's edge, feeling its rough texture beneath his fingertips. Memories drifted through him. The first time he stood watch, trembling. The night of the storm when he and his squad prayed together in the ruined tower. The morning he watched the sunrise paint everything gold and felt his heart calm for the first time in years. Each memory glowed faintly, like lanterns lit one after another along a long corridor. He closed his eyes. Gratitude swelled inside him, not only for what the fortress had given him, but for who it had allowed him to become. When he opened them again, the courtyard had fallen quieter. Only a few men remained awake, finishing tasks or speaking softly beneath the lantern light. He descended the wall steps slowly, taking in the sight of the place one final time. Every sound, every shadow, every breath of night air felt like it was carving itself into his memory. At the doorway of the barracks, he paused. One last look. Then he stepped inside, lay down on his cot, and watched the faint glow of the lantern outside stretch across the floorboards. His comrades slept around him, their breathing a steady rhythm he had grown used to. Comforting, grounding. He felt sleep tug at him gently, and as he drifted off, the first faint light of dawn began to gather behind the dunes, ready to open the final chapter. The morning light spilled gently across the desert, turning the dunes into smooth waves of gold. As he walked with the departing caravan, the fortress slowly shrank behind him until it was nothing more than a warm memory on the horizon. He felt no sting of regret, no ache of doubt, only a steady fullness inside him, a sense of completion that wrapped around him like a comforting cloak. The air was crisp, and each step seemed to settle something deep in his chest. The rhythmic clinking of camel bells mingled with the soft crunch of sand beneath hooves and boots. It was a familiar sound, one he had heard countless times on patrols, missions, and journeys, but today it carried a different tone. This was not the sound of leaving home or rushing toward danger. This was the sound of return, of chapters closing with dignity. He glanced back once more, though he had already said his farewells. The ribat stood still and strong against the morning sky, the very image of steadfastness. He He thought of the men inside, friends who had shaped him, mentors who had steadied his feet, students he had guided. He thought of the late nights under the stars, of whispered prayers, of the long path that had carved him from uncertainty into someone calmer, firmer, and more rooted. Ahead of him, the caravan stretched in a long line, its travelers quietly settling into the rhythm of the journey. Some were merchants heading toward distant cities. Others were soldiers returning home just as he was. A few had families waiting. Some would arrive to parents joyfully embracing them. Others would find empty places and memories. The desert made no promises. It simply carried whoever walked upon it. The sun climbed slowly, warming his back. He adjusted the strap of his pack and found the gesture strangely symbolic, a small reminder of the weight he carried and how differently he bore it now. Experience fit him well. The uncertainty that once clung to him like dust was gone. The fortress had taught him that fear and courage often walked together, and that service was less a matter of grand battles and more a matter of quiet integrity. At midday, the caravan stopped near a stretch of shade cast by a cluster of rocky outcrops. He sat with a few companions, silent men who had shared storms, skirmishes, and long watches with him. They spoke little, but the silence between them was filled with a thick, unspoken understanding. It was the kind of silence only those who had lived the same nights and breathed the same dust could share. He ate a simple meal, breaking bread slowly, letting its warmth settle in him. Someone passed water around. Someone else shared a story that drew a soft laugh from the group. Their laughter wasn't loud or youthful anymore. It was deeper, carrying the weight of things seen and survived. When the caravan moved again, the landscape began to shift. The dunes softened into closer hills. The air carried faint scents of greenery, and faint traces of distant settlements appeared on the horizon. Each familiar landmark nudged loose an old memory. His mother calling him for prayer, his siblings arguing over chores, the warmth of his home after long work in the fields. By the time the sun began its descent, casting elongated shadows across the land, he could feel the nearness of his village as surely as one feels the nearness of a warm fire on a cold night. He walked a little ahead of the group, letting his steps take him toward the place he had once left with anxious hope in his chest. Now, that same place welcomed him back with the promise of peace. And in that quiet approach, he understood fully what his journey had been. Not a story of battles or triumphs, but of growth, slow, patient, steady. He had left as a youth searching for purpose. He returned with honor, shaped not by glory, but by humility, service, and devotion. As the first roofs of his village came into view, and the evening breeze carried the familiar scent of palms and hearth smoke, he felt his heart settle completely. The story that had carried him across dunes and seasons now closed with a gentle certainty. He was home,